Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we journey to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, to a city where steel once forged the backbone of America. Johnstown sits nestled in the Allegheny Mountains, a place where generations have called home, where neighbors know each other's names, and where the rhythm of life moves at a gentler pace than the bustling cities beyond. But beneath this peaceful exterior, darkness can take root, growing slowly, imperceptibly, until it consumes everything in its path. This is the story of Nancy Giles, a 40-year-old woman whose life was cut short in the autumn of 2018. It's a tale that would unfold over nearly 6 years, revealing the depths of deception that can exist within the most intimate of relationships, and the persistent pursuit of justice that would ultimately bring truth to light. October 2018 painted Johnstown in brilliant hues of amber and crimson. The leaves drifted lazily from ancient maples, carpeting the sidewalks in a tapestry of fall. For Nancy Giles, this should have been a season of contentment. At 40 years old, she had built a life in this small Pennsylvania city, sharing an apartment with her husband, Brian Bradley Giles, in a house that had stood for decades, its walls holding the stories of countless families who had passed through its rooms. Nancy was the kind of woman who made an impression. Those who knew her described her as vibrant, someone who brought warmth to the spaces she occupied. She had made Johnstown her home, weaving herself into the fabric of the community through small gestures and everyday kindnesses that neighbors would remember long after she was gone. But on a crisp October day in 2018, Nancy Giles simply vanished. The disappearance wasn't immediate cause for alarm. People go missing for mundane reasons every day: a spontaneous trip, a misunderstanding about plans, a need for solitude. Brian Giles, Nancy's husband of several years, seemed as puzzled as anyone. When questioned by concerned friends and family, he offered explanations that seemed plausible enough at first glance. Perhaps she had gone to visit relatives. Maybe she needed time to think. These things happen in marriages, don't they? But as October faded into November, and November gave way to the harsh Pennsylvania winter, the absence of Nancy Giles became impossible to ignore. The woman who had been a constant presence in her community, who had maintained regular contact with those she cared about, had seemingly evaporated without a trace. No phone calls. No messages. No sightings. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. The Johnstown Police Department, led by dedicated officers who understood the rhythms of their small city, began to take notice. Missing person cases in tight-knit communities carry a particular weight. Everyone knows everyone, and when someone disappears, the ripples spread through the social fabric like stones dropped in still water. Detective Sergeant Corey Adams would later become intimately familiar with this case, spending years unraveling the web of lies that surrounded Nancy's disappearance. As winter settled over Johnstown, blanketing the city in snow and silence, the questions multiplied. Where was Nancy Giles? Why had she left without a word to anyone? And perhaps most troubling of all, what wasn't her husband Brian telling them? Brian Bradley Giles cut an unremarkable figure in Johnstown. At 48 years old, he was the type of man who could blend into a crowd, neither commanding attention nor inspiring particular notice. Those who knew him would later struggle to describe his character in definitive terms. He was quiet, they said. Kept to himself mostly. Seemed devoted to Nancy, though some noted an intensity in his demeanor that could be unsettling if you paid close attention. When Nancy first disappeared, Brian's explanations came readily enough. He told friends and family that Nancy had been feeling restless lately, that she had talked about needing space, about wanting to get away for a while. These explanations carried the ring of truth. Who among us hasn't felt the urge to escape our daily routines, to seek solitude in times of stress or uncertainty? But as the weeks turned to months, Brian's story began to shift like sand in an hourglass. The details changed in subtle ways. Sometimes Nancy had mentioned visiting distant relatives. Other times, she had talked about traveling alone, needing to find herself. When pressed for specifics, which relatives, what destinations, why no contact, Brian would grow vague, his answers dissolving into generalities that satisfied no one. Detective Sergeant Corey Adams, a veteran of the Johnstown Police Department, had encountered his share of missing person cases over the years. He understood the delicate balance required when dealing with worried families and potentially grieving spouses. But something about Brian Giles's demeanor set off quiet alarm bells in the experienced detective's mind. There was an inconsistency to his responses, a quality that suggested careful construction rather than honest recollection. Adams began to document these inconsistencies meticulously. In police work, patterns often emerge slowly, like photographs developing in a darkroom. Each conversation with Brian revealed small contradictions, tiny shifts in narrative that might seem insignificant in isolation but together painted a troubling picture. Brian's emotional responses seemed calibrated rather than genuine. His concern for Nancy appeared performative, as if he were playing a role he had studied but not fully internalized. As 2018 drew to a close, the Johnstown Police Department officially classified Nancy Giles as a missing person. But in the quiet moments between interviews and paperwork, Detective Adams found himself wondering if they were already too late. If Nancy Giles was indeed missing, where was she? And if she wasn't missing at all, if something more sinister had occurred, then what had become of the woman who had disappeared so completely from the life she had built in Johnstown? Spring arrived in Johnstown in 2019 with its usual promise of renewal. The snow melted from the hills surrounding the city, revealing the brown earth beneath and the first tentative shoots of new growth. It was a season of hope, of fresh beginnings, of secrets revealed as the winter's concealment finally gave way to the warming sun. On a day in May 2019, when the air carried the sweet scent of blooming dogwood and the distant sound of children playing in newly green yards, a hiker made a discovery that would shatter any remaining hope for Nancy Giles's safe return. The inclined plane in Johnstown is more than just a tourist attraction, it's a piece of living history, a testament to the ingenuity of past generations who carved their transportation routes into the steep hillsides of western Pennsylvania. The area around the incline has long been popular with hikers and nature enthusiasts, people seeking a quiet escape from the rhythms of daily life. The trails wind through patches of forest and overlook the city below, offering moments of solitude and reflection. It was along one of these trails, in a spot where the canopy of trees created deep shadows even in midday, that the hiker noticed something that didn't belong. What first appeared to be a natural depression in the earth revealed itself, upon closer inspection, to be something far more disturbing. Partially concealed by fallen leaves and the patient work of weather and time, the shallow grave held the remains of Nancy Giles. The discovery sent shockwaves through Johnstown. Here was the answer to the question that had haunted the community for 7 months, but it was an answer that no one had wanted to find. Nancy hadn't left town voluntarily. She hadn't started a new life somewhere else. She had been here all along, buried in the earth just miles from the apartment she had shared with her husband. The condition of the remains told a grim story. The Cambria County coroner, Jeff Lees, would later determine that Nancy had suffered brutal blunt force trauma to her skull. These weren't the injuries of an accident or a fall. They spoke of violence, of deliberate harm inflicted with terrible force. In October 2019, more than a year after Nancy's disappearance, Coroner Lees officially ruled her death a homicide. The news rippled through Johnstown like a stone dropped in still water. Neighbors who had wondered about Nancy's absence now understood the truth. The woman who had been part of their community, who had lived and worked among them, had been murdered and discarded like refuse in a shallow grave. The realization brought with it a mixture of grief and anger, sadness for Nancy and fury at whoever had taken her life so brutally. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the implication that hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. If Nancy Giles had been murdered and buried just months after her disappearance, then someone had been lying to the police, to her family, to her friends, and to the entire community for all those months. Someone had looked them in the eye and professed ignorance while knowing exactly where Nancy lay buried. Someone had attended search efforts and expressed hope for her safe return while having intimate knowledge of her fate. The question that had plagued Detective Adams from the beginning now took on new urgency. What did Brian Giles really know about his wife's disappearance, and when had he known it? The discovery of Nancy's remains transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide inquiry. Detective Sergeant Corey Adams, who had been documenting the inconsistencies in Brian Giles's statements for months, now found himself at the center of one of Johnstown's most significant criminal investigations in recent memory. Police work in cases like this requires a delicate balance of persistence and patience. Evidence must be gathered methodically, witness statements verified and cross-referenced, and every lead pursued regardless of how promising or futile it might appear. Adams understood that building a case strong enough to secure a conviction would require more than suspicion, more than inconsistent statements, more than the circumstantial evidence that pointed toward Brian Giles. The forensic examination of Nancy's remains provided crucial information. The blunt force trauma to her skull indicated a violent death, but the condition of the remains after months in the ground limited what investigators could determine about the specific circumstances of her murder. What they could say with certainty was that Nancy Giles had been killed deliberately, with significant force, and that her body had been carefully concealed in a location that suggested familiarity with the area. Meanwhile, Brian's behavior continued to raise red flags. When confronted with the news of Nancy's death, his reaction seemed carefully modulated, as if he were presenting an emotional response rather than experiencing one. He expressed shock and grief, but observers noted a quality to his performance that felt rehearsed. More troubling still were the continued inconsistencies in his statements about the period surrounding Nancy's disappearance. Detective Adams began to realize that Brian Giles was not just an unreliable witness, he was a suspect who had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a year. The investigation took on new dimensions as Adams and his team worked to reconstruct the timeline of Nancy's final days. They interviewed neighbors, friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have had contact with Nancy in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had given no indication of planning to leave Johnstown, who had made no preparations for travel, who had left behind all of her personal belongings and important documents. More significantly, the investigation revealed troubling patterns in Brian and Nancy's relationship. While neighbors had seen them as a relatively quiet couple, closer examination revealed signs of tension, of conflicts that had been carefully hidden from public view. Brian, it seemed, had been struggling with personal issues that he had concealed from most people in his life. The facade of normalcy that he had maintained began to crack under the scrutiny of the investigation. But despite the mounting evidence and the growing certainty among investigators that Brian Giles was responsible for his wife's murder, the case remained frustratingly incomplete. They needed more than suspicion and inconsistent statements. They needed concrete evidence that would link Brian directly to Nancy's death, evidence that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. That evidence would come from an unexpected source, in the form of a witness who had remained silent for years, carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. In the world of criminal investigation, cases often turn on the smallest details, a fragment of evidence overlooked for months, a witness who finally finds the courage to speak, a piece of technology that reveals hidden truths. The Nancy Giles case would be no different, but the breakthrough would come from a source that nobody had anticipated. In May 2021, nearly 3 years after Nancy's disappearance and 2 years after the discovery of her remains, someone came forward with information that would finally give investigators the evidence they needed. This witness, whose identity was carefully protected, had been carrying the burden of terrible knowledge for years, watching as the investigation unfolded while harboring secrets that could change everything. The witness revealed that Brian Giles had made statements about Nancy's death that went far beyond the vague explanations he had offered to police. According to this individual, Brian had admitted to being present when Nancy died, though his version of events painted the incident as an accident rather than a deliberate act of violence. Brian's story, as related by the witness, was that Nancy had fallen in the bathroom of their apartment, striking her head with fatal results. Panicked and unsure what to do, Brian claimed he had decided to bury Nancy's body rather than call for help. It was a decision born of fear and confusion, he maintained, not malice or premeditation. This account provided investigators with the missing piece of their puzzle. While Brian's version of events portrayed Nancy's death as accidental, several aspects of his story raised immediate questions. If Nancy had indeed died in a bathroom fall, why were her injuries consistent with multiple blows rather than a single impact? Why had Brian chosen to bury her body in a remote location rather than seek medical help or contact authorities? And most damning of all, why had he spent months lying to police, family, and friends about Nancy's whereabouts if her death had truly been an accident? Detective Adams saw through Brian's revised narrative immediately. The story of an accidental fall followed by a panicked burial was clearly a carefully constructed lie designed to minimize Brian's culpability while acknowledging the facts that were becoming impossible to deny. It was an attempt to control the narrative, to admit to the least serious version of events that could still account for the physical evidence. But the witness's testimony provided more than just Brian's revised story. It also offered insights into his behavior in the weeks and months following Nancy's disappearance, behavior that painted a picture of a man who was not grieving for a lost wife but rather managing the fallout from a crime he had committed. Armed with this new testimony, investigators felt confident enough to move forward. On May 13, 2022, nearly 4 years after Nancy Giles had vanished from her Johnstown home, police arrested Brian Bradley Giles and charged him with homicide in his wife's death. The arrest sent shockwaves through Johnstown's close-knit community. While many residents had suspected Brian's involvement, the official charges transformed speculation into legal reality. The man who had spent years portraying himself as a grieving husband searching for answers was now revealed as the primary suspect in his wife's brutal murder. For Detective Adams and the Johnstown Police Department, the arrest represented the culmination of years of patient investigative work. But they understood that their real challenge was just beginning. Now they would have to prove their case in court, convincing a jury that Brian Giles was not the victim of tragic circumstances he claimed to be, but rather a cold-blooded killer who had murdered his wife and spent years lying about it. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and the case against Brian Giles would be no exception. Following his arrest in May 2022, the legal proceedings became mired in complications that would delay the trial for nearly 2 years. The first setback came when Brian's attorney was found to have a conflict of interest, requiring the appointment of new counsel and pushing back the trial date. These delays, while frustrating for those seeking justice for Nancy, provided the prosecution with additional time to strengthen their case. District Attorney Gregory Neugebauer and his team worked methodically to build a narrative that would convince a jury of Brian's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They faced the challenge of presenting a case built largely on circumstantial evidence, inconsistent statements, and witness testimony rather than direct physical evidence linking Brian to the crime. The prosecution's strategy centered on demonstrating the pattern of deception that had characterized Brian's behavior from the moment Nancy disappeared. They would show the jury how Brian's stories had shifted and evolved over time, how his emotional responses had seemed calculated rather than genuine, and how his actions in the weeks and months following Nancy's disappearance were consistent with those of a guilty man rather than a grieving husband. Central to their case was the testimony of Detective Sergeant Corey Adams, who had documented Brian's inconsistencies with meticulous care. Adams would later testify that, "The only consistencies from October 2018 to last week are Brian's inconsistencies. Brian keeps trying to explain away his lies with more lies." The defense, meanwhile, would attempt to portray Brian as a man who had made poor decisions in a moment of panic but was not a cold-blooded killer. They would argue that Nancy's death had indeed been accidental, and that Brian's subsequent actions, while perhaps legally culpable, were the result of fear and confusion rather than malicious intent. But as the case prepared to go to trial, another complication emerged that would cast an even darker shadow over Brian Giles. In 2020, another woman named Jilly Tadero had been reported missing from Johnstown. Like Nancy, Jilly had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that had puzzled investigators for several years. The connection between these two disappearances might have remained hidden forever, but construction work and renovations often have a way of revealing secrets that were meant to stay buried. In June 2024, just days after Brian's conviction for Nancy's murder, workers conducting renovations at the house where Brian and Nancy had lived made a grisly discovery in the basement. Human remains, later identified as those of Jilly Tadero, were found concealed beneath the foundation of the building. The discovery transformed Brian Giles from a man convicted of one murder into a suspected serial killer, and raised horrifying questions about how many other victims there might be. When Brian Bradley Giles finally faced trial for the murder of his wife in June 2024, the courtroom in Cambria County was packed with observers. Nancy's family and friends sat in the gallery, seeking the justice that had been delayed for nearly 6 years. Members of the community who had followed the case from its beginning were there to witness the conclusion of a story that had haunted Johnstown for years. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Gregory Neugebauer, painted a picture of a manipulative and violent man who had murdered his wife in cold blood and then spent years constructing elaborate lies to cover his tracks. They presented evidence of the blunt force trauma that had killed Nancy, testimony about Brian's shifting and inconsistent statements, and the witness testimony that had finally broken the case open. The key to the prosecution's case was demonstrating the pattern of deception that had characterized Brian's behavior from the very beginning. They showed how his initial explanations for Nancy's disappearance had been plausible enough to buy him time, but how each subsequent version of events had contradicted the last. They argued that this was not the behavior of an innocent man caught in tragic circumstances, but rather the calculated actions of a killer trying to stay ahead of an investigation. Detective Sergeant Corey Adams took the stand to describe the years-long investigation and the frustration of dealing with a suspect who seemed to have an answer for everything, even when those answers contradicted his previous statements. Adams testified about the meticulous process of documenting Brian's inconsistencies and the growing certainty among investigators that they were dealing with a murder rather than a missing person case. The prosecution also presented evidence about the location where Nancy's body was found. The shallow grave near the inclined plane trail was not a random choice, they argued, but rather a location selected by someone familiar with the area, someone who understood the terrain well enough to choose a spot where the body might remain hidden indefinitely. Brian Giles, they pointed out, had lived in Johnstown for years and would have known the hiking trails intimately. Perhaps most damaging to Brian's case was the testimony of the witness who had finally come forward with information about Brian's admissions. This individual described conversations in which Brian had revealed knowledge of Nancy's death that went far beyond what an innocent husband would know. The witness testified that Brian had described Nancy's death as an accident, but had also revealed details about the disposal of her body that contradicted his public claims of ignorance. The defense attempted to portray Brian as a man who had made terrible decisions in a moment of panic but was not a premeditated killer. They argued that Nancy's death had indeed been accidental, as Brian had claimed, and that his subsequent actions were the result of fear and poor judgment rather than malicious intent. They painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control, who had made the wrong choice in a moment of crisis and then compounded that error with a series of increasingly desperate lies. But the defense faced an uphill battle. The physical evidence of Nancy's injury suggested deliberate violence rather than an accidental fall. The careful concealment of her body indicated premeditation and calculation. Most damaging of all was the years-long pattern of deception that had characterized Brian's behavior that was difficult to reconcile with the actions of an innocent man caught in tragic circumstances. The trial lasted several days, with both sides presenting their cases with the thoroughness that such a serious matter demanded. But when the jury retired to deliberate, they would not need much time to reach their conclusion. After approximately 1 hour of deliberations, a remarkably short time for such a complex case, the jury returned with their verdict. Brian Bradley Giles was found guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated assault in the death of his wife Nancy. The speed of the jury's decision spoke volumes about the strength of the prosecution's case and the weakness of Brian's defense. The evidence, while largely circumstantial, had painted a clear picture of guilt that the jury found compelling and convincing. The conviction of Brian Giles for first-degree murder carried with it an automatic sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the formal sentencing hearing in August 2024 would prove to be almost as dramatic as the trial itself, revealing the true character of the man who had spent years manipulating everyone around him. When Brian Giles stood before the judge to receive his sentence, the mask of the grieving husband finally slipped completely away. Instead of accepting responsibility for his actions or expressing remorse for Nancy's death, Brian launched into a profanity-laden tirade that shocked everyone present. He cursed at the prosecutors who had secured his conviction, berated his own attorneys for their handling of his defense, and showed contempt for the entire legal process. "Oh, I'm so scared," Brian sneered at the judge, his voice dripping with sarcasm and defiance. The outburst was so disruptive that he had to be physically removed from the courtroom, still shouting obscenities and threats as bailiffs escorted him away. For those who had followed the case from the beginning, Brian's courtroom meltdown was revealing in ways he probably never intended. Here, finally, was the real Brian Giles, not the confused and grieving husband he had portrayed for years, but an angry, violent man who showed no remorse for taking his wife's life and no respect for the legal system that had finally held him accountable. The sentencing brought a measure of closure to Nancy's family and friends, but it also raised troubling questions about what else Brian might have done during his years in Johnstown. The discovery of Jilly Tadero's remains in the basement of his former home had already prompted investigators to look at Brian as a potential serial killer. Were there other victims? Other women who had trusted Brian Giles and paid for that trust with their lives? Investigators began the painstaking process of reviewing other missing person cases from the Johnstown area, looking for any connections to Brian Giles. They examined his history, his movements, his associations, searching for patterns that might reveal additional crimes. The man who had seemed so unremarkable to his neighbors was now being scrutinized as potentially one of Pennsylvania's most prolific killers. The case also highlighted the importance of persistent police work and the courage of witnesses who come forward with difficult information. Without Detective Sergeant Corey Adams's meticulous documentation of Brian's inconsistencies, and without the witness who finally revealed Brian's admissions, justice for Nancy Giles might never have been achieved. As Brian began serving his life sentence, the investigation into his other potential crimes continued. The discovery of Jilly Tadero's remains led to additional charges, though prosecutors announced they would not seek the death penalty in that case. The focus now was on ensuring that Brian would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. The murder of Nancy Giles and the long journey to justice that followed offer sobering lessons about the nature of intimate partner violence and the challenges facing law enforcement when investigating such crimes. Nancy's case demonstrates how predators can hide in plain sight, maintaining facades of normalcy while harboring violent tendencies that eventually explode into lethal action. Brian Giles was able to deceive not just investigators but an entire community for years, presenting himself as a concerned husband while knowing exactly what had happened to his wife. His ability to manipulate those around him, to craft plausible explanations for Nancy's absence, and to maintain his deception even under police scrutiny speaks to a level of calculation and callousness that is truly chilling. The case also highlights the crucial role that witnesses play in the pursuit of justice. The individual who finally came forward with information about Brian's admissions carried that burden for years, perhaps struggling with whether to reveal what they knew. Their eventual decision to speak to investigators proved to be the key that unlocked the entire case, demonstrating that sometimes justice depends on the courage of ordinary people to do what is right. For the Johnstown community, Nancy's murder shattered assumptions about safety and trust. Here was a woman who had been killed not by a stranger or a random criminal, but by the person who was supposed to protect and cherish her. Her death served as a stark reminder that domestic violence can escalate to murder without warning, and that the most dangerous person in a woman's life is often someone she knows intimately. Detective Sergeant Corey Adams and the other investigators who worked on Nancy's case demonstrated the importance of persistence in police work. Despite the frustrations of dealing with an uncooperative and deceptive suspect, despite the months and years that passed without resolution, they continued to document evidence and pursue leads. Their dedication ultimately made justice possible. The discovery of Jilly Tadero's remains added another layer of tragedy to an already horrific case. How many other women might have crossed paths with Brian Giles? How many families might still be wondering what happened to their loved ones? These questions serve as a reminder that some criminals leave trails of destruction that extend far beyond their known victims. As Nancy Giles was finally laid to rest, her family and friends could take some comfort in knowing that her killer would never again walk free. But the scars left by her murder, on those who loved her, on the community that had searched for her, and on the investigators who had worked so hard to find the truth, would take much longer to heal. The case stands as a testament to Nancy's memory and a warning about the violence that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary relationships. In the quiet hills of Pennsylvania where Nancy made her home, her story continues to resonate, a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved through the dedication of those who refuse to let the truth remain buried. Tonight, as we close this chapter of Nancy Giles's story, we're reminded that behind every true crime case lies a human being whose life was cut short, whose dreams were never realized, whose potential was stolen by violence. Nancy was more than just a victim, she was a daughter, a friend, a member of a community who cared about her and mourned her loss. The hills around Johnstown continue to change with the seasons, as they have for generations. The trails where Nancy's body was found still welcome hikers seeking solitude and natural beauty. Life continues in the small Pennsylvania city, but Nancy's memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew her and in the dedication of the investigators who never stopped seeking justice on her behalf. Brian Giles will spend the rest of his life behind bars, his freedom forfeited for the crime he committed against the woman who had trusted him with her life. The manipulation and deception that characterized his behavior for so many years have finally been exposed, his true nature revealed for all to see. As we drift toward sleep tonight, we can take some comfort in knowing that Nancy Giles did not die in vain. Her case serves as a reminder of the importance of speaking up when something doesn't seem right, of supporting those who work tirelessly to seek justice for the victims of violent crime, and of never forgetting that behind every statistic is a human story that deserves to be told and remembered. The truth, as difficult as it sometimes is to uncover, has finally come to light. And in that truth, Nancy Giles has found the justice that was so long denied to her. Rest in peace, Nancy. Your story has been told, your killer has been caught, and your memory will endure long after the man who took your life has been forgotten. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we delve into a case that shook the quiet college town of Moscow, Idaho to its very core. It's a story that began on what seemed like an ordinary November evening in 2022 and ended in unimaginable tragedy. For young lives, full of promise and dreams, were cut short in the early morning hours of November 13th. This is the story of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, and the man who would ultimately confess to taking their lives. As you settle in for the night, let me take you through the events that unfolded in that three-story house at 1122 King Road, where friendship, love, and youth collided with darkness in ways that would forever change a community. Picture a typical college rental house in a small university town. The three-story home at 1122 King Road wasn't particularly remarkable from the outside. It was the kind of place where students gathered, where laughter echoed through thin walls, and where the chaos of young adult life played out in all its messy glory. 6 bedrooms spread across 3 floors housed 5 female University of Idaho students during the fall semester of 2022. The house had become a hub of social activity, as college houses often do. It was a place where friends would drop by unannounced, where weekend parties spilled from room to room, and where the bonds of friendship were strengthened through shared experiences of navigating university life. The layout was simple but accommodating, 2 bedrooms on each floor, creating distinct living spaces that nonetheless felt connected by the common areas and the easy familiarity that comes from sharing a home. Living on the second floor were Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves, 2 best friends whose friendship had become legendary among their circle. They had grown so close that they often shared a bed, treating each other more like sisters than roommates. Their bond was the kind that develops when 2 people understand each other on a fundamental level, finishing each other's sentences, sharing clothes without asking, and creating inside jokes that only they understood. On the 3rd floor lived Xana Kernodle, a vibrant young woman who brought her own energy to the household. She was dating Ethan Chapin, a young man who, while not a resident of the house, had become a frequent presence there. Their relationship was one of those sweet college romances that friends enjoyed watching unfold, genuine, caring, and full of the kind of optimism that comes with being young and in love. The 1st floor housed 2 other students who would, by a twist of fate that haunts many who knew them, sleep through the events that would unfold in the early morning hours of November 13th. Madison Mogen, at 21 years old, carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing who you are. She had grown up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in a family that valued hard work and education. Madison was pursuing her studies with determination, but she also knew how to balance academics with the social aspects of college life. She had an infectious laugh and a way of making everyone around her feel included. Her friends often described her as the glue that held their group together, the one who remembered birthdays, who checked in when someone was having a rough day, and who could turn an ordinary evening into an adventure. Kaylee Goncalves, also 21, was Madison's perfect complement. Where Madison was steady and nurturing, Kaylee was spontaneous and bold. She brought an energy to every room she entered, the kind of person who could convince her friends to take midnight trips to get ice cream or to attend events they would never have considered on their own. Kaylee had plans after graduation, big dreams that extended beyond the borders of Moscow, Idaho. She was preparing to move to Austin, Texas, to start a new chapter of her life, but first, she wanted to savor these final months with her best friend and the community they had built together. The friendship between Madison and Kaylee was one of those rare connections that everyone recognized as special. They had met during their freshman year and quickly became inseparable. Their friends often joked that you couldn't invite one without the other, and if you did, you'd inevitably find them together anyway. They shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams, and fears. They had already begun making plans for how they would maintain their friendship after graduation, with Kaylee's move to Texas and Madison's own post-graduation plans. Xana Kernodle, at 20, was the kind of person who brought light wherever she went. Originally from Avondale, Arizona, she had found her place in the social fabric of the University of Idaho. Xana was known for her kindness and her ability to make others feel comfortable. She had a gift for seeing the best in people and wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed in. Her relationship with Ethan had blossomed into something beautiful, the kind of young love that made their friends believe in romance again. Ethan Chapin, also 20, was a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity and had found his niche in the university's Greek life system. He was from Conway, Washington, and had the kind of easygoing personality that made him popular among his peers. Ethan was studying recreation, sport, and tourism management, and had dreams of working in outdoor recreation after graduation. His relationship with Xana had brought out the best in both of them. They supported each other's goals while building something meaningful together. These four young people had their whole lives stretched out before them. They were at that magical time in life where everything seems possible, where the future is bright with potential, and where the present moment feels eternal. They were building friendships that they expected to last a lifetime, pursuing educations that would open doors to careers they were passionate about, and creating memories that they planned to laugh about for decades to come. November 12, 2022, was a Saturday, and like many Saturdays in a college town, it was filled with the comfortable routines and social activities that defined student life. The day began quietly at the King Road house, with the kind of lazy morning energy that follows a Friday night out. The housemates went about their day with the casual ease of people who had grown comfortable in each other's presence. As the afternoon wore on, the normal rhythms of weekend life took hold. There was talk about evening plans, the kind of discussions that happen in college houses every weekend: who was going where, when to meet up, what to wear. The atmosphere was relaxed and filled with the anticipation that comes with a Saturday night stretching ahead. Madison and Kaylee made plans to go out together, as they always did. Their friendship had reached the point where they moved through their social world as a unit, making decisions together and looking out for each other in the way that best friends do. They prepared for their evening with the kind of care that college students put into their weekend appearances, choosing outfits, doing their hair, and probably taking the kind of photos that would later be treasured as snapshots of their friendship. The evening took them to a local food truck, where they grabbed a late-night meal. These kinds of casual food stops were part of the rhythm of student life, satisfying late-night hunger with whatever was available and convenient. For Madison and Kaylee, it was probably just another ordinary moment in what they expected to be many more years of shared experiences. Meanwhile, Xana and Ethan were spending time together, enjoying their Saturday evening in the way that young couples do. Ethan, who didn't live at the King Road house, had come over to spend time with Xana, and they were planning to spend the night together. Their relationship had developed to the point where Ethan's presence at the house was natural and expected. He had become part of the extended family that had formed around the group of friends. As the evening progressed into late night, the house settled into its familiar weekend rhythm. Friends came and went, conversations flowed, and the kind of connection that defines close friendships was evident in every interaction. There was probably music playing, laughter echoing through the rooms, and the comfortable chaos that comes with young people enjoying each other's company. The two housemates on the first floor went to bed earlier, preparing for Sunday with the kind of practical thinking that balances social life with academic responsibilities. They said their goodnights and settled into their rooms, expecting to wake up to the familiar sounds of their housemates starting another day. Madison and Kaylee eventually made their way to Madison's room on the second floor, where they often slept together, their friendship having evolved to the point where sharing a bed was as natural as sharing clothes or secrets. It was a testament to the depth of their bond and the comfort they found in each other's presence. On the third floor, Xana and Ethan settled in for the night in Xana's room. They were probably making plans for Sunday, maybe talking about upcoming events or sharing the kind of intimate conversations that define young relationships. The house grew quiet as everyone settled into sleep, with no one aware that this would be their final night together. The early morning hours of November 13th brought an unimaginable darkness to the King Road house. Police say the victims were most likely asleep when they were attacked, and preliminary autopsy results show that the four victims were likely attacked with a large knife and died sometime after 2 a.m. from multiple stab wounds. What happened in those dark hours has been pieced together through forensic evidence, police reports, and ultimately, through the confession of the perpetrator. The attack was swift and brutal, carried out by someone who had apparently been planning this horrific act. The peace of the sleeping house was shattered by violence that would leave a community reeling and families forever changed. The evidence suggests that the killer moved through the house with a terrifying purpose. Madison appeared to be laying up against Kaylee. Madison had what appeared to be wounds to her forearm and hands, suggesting that she may have awakened and tried to defend herself or her best friend. The forensic evidence painted a picture of chaos and terror, but also of the bonds of friendship that remained strong even in the face of unthinkable violence. Kernadle's fatal injuries were stab wounds to her lung and heart. She had over 50 stab wounds, mostly defensive, according to a report. This evidence suggests that Xana fought desperately for her life, trying to protect herself with a courage that speaks to her character even in her final moments. The defensive wounds tell a story of someone who did not give up, who fought with everything she had against an attacker who had entered her home, her safe space, with deadly intent. Both Mogan and Goncalves were stabbed in the lung and liver. Goncalves also had 2 brain bleeds and a stab behind her clavicle, which cut the vein and artery. The extent of the injury speaks to the savage nature of the attack and the determination of the perpetrator to ensure that his victims could not survive to identify him. Ethan, who had been sleeping beside Xana, was also attacked and killed. He had no chance to defend himself or his girlfriend, falling victim to an attacker who showed no mercy and no recognition of the humanity of his victims. The attack was over quickly, leaving 4 young lives extinguished and a house filled with the kind of silence that follows unimaginable tragedy. The killer fled into the night, leaving behind a scene that would haunt the investigators who responded and devastate a community that had never experienced anything like this level of violence. Morning came to the King Road house with its usual routines, but something was wrong. The 2 surviving housemates on the first floor began their day expecting to hear the familiar sounds of their friends starting Sunday. Instead, they found silence where there should have been conversation, stillness where there should have been the comfortable noise of a house full of young people. As the morning progressed, concern began to build. Phone calls went unanswered, text messages received no responses. The kind of communication that was constant among the friend group had stopped, creating an absence that felt increasingly ominous. Between 10 and 11 a.m., Bethany wakes up and checks her Find My app to discover that Kaylee, Maddie weren't responding in their usual way. Friends began to worry. In a generation accustomed to constant communication, the silence was particularly alarming. These were young people who shared their daily lives through texts, social media, and phone calls. The absence of that communication created a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. When friends arrived at the house and made the discovery, their world changed forever. The scene they encountered was beyond anything they could have imagined. The reality of what had happened to their friends, to people they loved and had shared countless memories with, was too enormous to comprehend immediately. The call to 911 brought law enforcement rushing to the scene. The first responders who arrived found themselves confronting a crime scene unlike anything Moscow, Idaho, had ever seen. The small college town, where the most serious crimes were typically alcohol-related offenses and minor thefts, was suddenly dealing with a quadruple homicide that would draw national attention and forever change the community's sense of security. The Moscow Police Department, working alongside the Idaho State Police and FBI, launched an investigation that would consume thousands of hours and involve hundreds of interviews. The challenge they faced was enormous: 4 victims, no obvious motive, and a crime scene that provided tantalizing clues but no immediate answers. The investigation team had to work methodically through every aspect of the victims' lives, looking for connections that might explain why they had been targeted. They interviewed friends, family members, professors, employers, and anyone else who had contact with Madison, Kaylee, Xana, or Ethan in the weeks and months leading up to the murders. The forensic evidence collection was painstaking and thorough. Every surface, every item, every trace of DNA or fingerprints had to be carefully catalogued and analyzed. The house at 1122 King Road became a crime scene that investigators would examine with microscopic attention to detail, looking for any evidence that might lead them to the perpetrator. One of the most challenging aspects of the investigation was the sheer randomness of the crime. There was no apparent connection between the victims and any obvious suspect. They were well-liked students with no known enemies, no involvement in dangerous activities, and no apparent reason why someone would want to harm them. This lack of obvious motive made the investigation more complex and required investigators to cast a much wider net in their search for leads. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Vigils were held, support groups formed, and the entire university struggled to come to terms with the loss of 4 of their own. Students who had felt safe walking around campus at night suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders, and parents across the country began questioning whether their own children were safe at their universities. Media attention descended on Moscow, Idaho, with reporters and camera crews transforming the quiet college town into the center of a national news story. The investigation became public in ways that the small police department had never experienced, adding pressure to solve the case quickly while maintaining the integrity of the evidence collection process. As days turned into weeks, the investigation expanded in scope and intensity. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to develop a profile of the killer, analyzing the crime scene and the nature of the attacks to try to understand what kind of person could commit such an act. The profile that emerged suggested someone with knowledge of the house and its occupants, someone who had likely observed the victims and their routines. The targeted nature of the attack, the fact that 2 housemates were left unharmed, and the apparent familiarity with the house layout all pointed to someone who had done reconnaissance before carrying out the murders. Tips poured in from across the country as the case gained national attention. Every lead had to be investigated, every possible connection explored. The investigation team worked around the clock, following up on hundreds of tips and investigating dozens of potential suspects. One of the key pieces of evidence that investigators focused on was a white Hyundai Elantra that had been spotted in the area around the time of the murders. This vehicle became a crucial lead, and investigators put out a public request for information about any white Hyundai Elantra that might be connected to the case. The forensic evidence from the crime scene was being processed by laboratories across the country. DNA analysis, fingerprint comparison, and other scientific techniques were being used to try to identify the perpetrator. The process was slow and methodical, but investigators knew that this evidence would be crucial to solving the case and ensuring that justice was served. On December 30th, suspect Brian Christopher Kohberger was arrested in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest came after weeks of intensive investigation and represented a breakthrough that brought hope to the families and community that had been living with uncertainty and fear. Brian Kohberger was a 28-year-old PhD student in criminal justice and criminology at Washington State University, located just a few miles from the University of Idaho campus. Kohberger, a former criminology PhD student, was indicted earlier this year in the November 2022 killings. The irony was not lost on investigators. A man studying criminal behavior had allegedly committed one of the most heinous crimes in Idaho's recent history. Kohberger had driven cross-country to his parents' home in Pennsylvania for the holidays, and it was there that law enforcement caught up with him. Police announced an arrest of a apprehended in northeastern Pennsylvania, about 2,500 miles from the Idaho campus, and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and burglary. The arrest was the result of traditional detective work combined with modern forensic science. DNA evidence collected at the crime scene had been matched to Kohberger, providing investigators with the scientific proof they needed to connect him to the murders. The white Hyundai Elantra that had been spotted near the scene belonged to Kohberger, adding another piece to the evidentiary puzzle. Brian Kohberger presented a puzzling figure to investigators and the public. He was an academic, someone who should have understood the consequences of criminal behavior better than most. He was pursuing a PhD in criminal justice, studying the very system that would now be prosecuting him for multiple murders. Those who knew Kohberger described him as intelligent but socially awkward, someone who seemed to struggle with normal social interactions despite his academic success. Classmates and professors noted that he was interested in the psychological aspects of criminal behavior, sometimes to a degree that made others uncomfortable. The investigation into Kohberger's background revealed a pattern of behavior that, in retrospect, seemed concerning. He had allegedly stalked the house on King Road multiple times before the murders, driving by and observing the routines of the residents. Phone records and surveillance footage would later show his phone in the area of the house on multiple occasions in the weeks leading up to the murders. The question that haunted everyone was why. What could drive someone to commit such a senseless act of violence against people he apparently didn't know personally? The victims had no connection to Kohberger that investigators could discover. They didn't share classes, social circles, or any apparent interaction that might explain why he would target them. The legal case against Brian Kohberger began with his extradition from Pennsylvania back to Idaho. The process was complicated by the fact that Idaho is one of the few states that still uses the death penalty, and the prosecution made it clear that they would be seeking capital punishment in this case. The evidence against Kohberger was substantial. DNA evidence placed him at the scene of the crime. His cell phone data showed him in the area multiple times before the murders and near the house on the night of the killings. The white Hyundai Elantra registered to him had been spotted near the scene at the time of the murders. For more than 2 years, Kohberger maintained his innocence, with his defense team preparing for what would have been a lengthy and highly publicized trial. The case drew national attention, with legal experts and true crime enthusiasts following every development in the proceedings. The families of the victims endured this long legal process, waiting for justice while reliving their loss through court filings, media coverage, and the slow progression of the legal system. They attended hearings, made statements, and worked to keep the memory of their loved ones alive while seeking accountability for their deaths. On July 2, weeks before the trial was set to start, Kohberger pleaded guilty to all counts. The confession came as a surprise to many who had been following the case, as Kohberger had maintained his innocence for more than 2 years. The guilty plea meant that the families would be spared the trauma of a lengthy trial, but it also meant that many questions about motive and the specific details of that horrible night would remain unanswered. Many questions remain after Brian Kohberger decided to plead guilty to the murders of the 4 students. The confession was a moment of both relief and frustration for the families and community. Relief that there would be justice and that Kohberger would be held accountable for his actions. Frustration that they might never fully understand why this happened to their loved ones. On July 23, 2025, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences in prison without parole, as well as another 10 years for burglary. Hitler imposes his punishment against Kohberger, 10 years in prison for the 1 count of burglary and 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole to be served consecutively for each first-degree murder count. The sentencing hearing was emotional, with family members of the victims given the opportunity to make impact statements. They spoke about the young people they had lost, the dreams that would never be fulfilled, and the impact that these murders had on their families and community. Madison's family spoke about her kindness, her loyalty to her friends, and the bright future that had been stolen from her. They described a young woman who brought joy to everyone around her and who had been looking forward to the next chapter of her life. Kaylee's family shared memories of her adventurous spirit, her plans to move to Texas, and the special friendship she had shared with Madison. They spoke about the hole that her death had left in their lives and the difficulty of imagining a future without her laughter and energy. Xana's family remembered her compassion, her ability to make others feel welcomed and valued, and the love she had shared with Ethan. They spoke about the unfairness of having her life cut short just as she was discovering who she wanted to become. Ethan's family shared their grief over losing a son who had brought so much joy to their lives, who had found love with Xana, and who had been pursuing his dreams with enthusiasm and determination. The scene of the crime, 1122 King Road, was demolished on December 28, 2023, after the property owner donated the home to the school. The decision to demolish the house was controversial, with some family members feeling that it destroyed important evidence and others feeling that it was necessary to help the community heal. The University of Idaho and the Moscow community worked to find ways to honor the memory of the 4 students while also moving forward from the tragedy. Scholarships were established in their names, memorial gardens were planted, and their friends worked to ensure that Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan would be remembered for the joy they brought to the world rather than the violence that ended their lives. The case changed the way many people think about safety, particularly in small college towns that had previously felt immune to this kind of random violence. Campus security was increased, students became more aware of their surroundings, and families across the country had difficult conversations about personal safety. For the surviving housemates, the trauma of discovering their friends and living through the investigation and trial process created challenges that will last a lifetime. They have had to find ways to honor their friends' memory while also rebuilding their own lives in the shadow of unimaginable loss. As we come to the end of this story, it's important to remember that Madison Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were much more than victims of a crime. They were young people with dreams, ambitions, and the kind of bright futures that make their loss so particularly tragic. Madison was the kind of friend everyone hopes to have, loyal, caring, and always ready to support those she loved. Her friendship with Kaylee was something special, the kind of bond that enriches both lives and creates memories that should have lasted a lifetime. Kaylee brought energy and adventure to everything she did. She was ready to take on the world, to explore new places and have new experiences. Her plans to move to Texas represented the kind of courage and optimism that define the best of young adulthood. Xana had a gift for making others feel valued and included. Her relationship with Ethan was built on mutual respect and genuine care, the kind of young love that makes everyone around it believe in the possibility of happiness. Ethan was pursuing his passions and building relationships that brought out the best in him. His love for Xana and his involvement in campus life showed someone who was engaged with the world around him and committed to making the most of his college experience. These four young people represent thousands of college students across the country who are pursuing their educations, building friendships, and preparing for their futures. Their loss reminds us how precious and fragile life can be, and how important it is to cherish the time we have with the people we love. The Idaho student murders remain a story that defies easy understanding. The randomness of the violence, the lack of clear motive, and the seemingly normal life of the perpetrator challenge our assumptions about criminal behavior and personal safety. What we can take from this tragedy is the importance of community, the power of friendship, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable loss. The families of Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan have shown remarkable strength in their grief, working to honor their loved ones' memories while also supporting each other through the legal process and its aftermath. The University of Idaho community, the town of Moscow, and people across the country who followed this case have been reminded of the importance of looking out for one another, of cherishing the relationships we have, and of not taking for granted the safety and security that we often assume will always be there. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll think about the four young people whose lives were celebrated in this story. Remember them not for how they died, but for how they lived, with friendship, love, hope, and the kind of optimism that makes tragedy so much more tragic when it strikes. Their story is one of loss, but it's also one of the enduring power of human connection and the importance of holding tight to the people we love. In a world that can sometimes seem dark and unpredictable, the bonds of friendship and family remain sources of light and hope. Please, I'm just putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're exploring a case that changed the American criminal justice system forever. This is the story of 12-year-old Polly Klaas, whose tragic fate in 1993 would spark nationwide conversations about child safety, repeat offenders, and the very nature of justice itself. It was October 1, 1993, in the quiet town of Petaluma, California. Nestled in Sonoma County, about 40 miles north of San Francisco, Petaluma was the kind of place where children still played outside until dark, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where the most serious crime was usually a burglary or petty theft. It was a community where parents felt safe, where childhood innocence seemed protected by tree-lined streets and familiar faces. On this particular Friday evening, 12-year-old Polly Hannah Kloss was doing what countless children across America were doing that night, having a sleepover with her best friends. Polly was a vivacious, spirited girl with long brown hair and bright eyes that seemed to dance when she laughed. Those who knew her described her as energetic and outgoing, the kind of child who lit up a room simply by being in it. The sleepover was taking place at Polly's mother's house on 4th Street, a modest home in a residential neighborhood where the sounds of evening settled into a comfortable quiet. Polly's mother, Eve Nickel, had divorced from Polly's father, Mark Kloss, but both parents remained deeply involved in their daughter's life. That evening, Eve had given the girls permission to stay up late, knowing that sleepovers were a special ritual of childhood, filled with whispered secrets, shared snacks, and the kind of bonding that creates lifelong friendships. Polly's two friends had arrived earlier that evening, their overnight bags packed with pajamas, toothbrushes, and the excited anticipation that comes with spending the night away from home. The three girls had spent the early part of the evening doing typical sleepover activities, painting their nails, listening to music, and talking about school, friends, and the thousand small dramas that make up a 12-year-old's world. As the evening wore on, they settled into Polly's bedroom to play board games. The room was decorated as you might expect a 7th grader's room to be: posters on the walls, stuffed animals on the bed, books and school supplies scattered on the desk. It was a sanctuary of childhood, a place where Polly could be herself, surrounded by the things she loved. By 10:30 that night, Eve had settled into her own bedroom, just adjacent to Polly's room. She could hear the muffled sounds of the girls' laughter and conversation through the thin walls, the comfortable sounds of children being children. These were the sounds of safety, of normalcy, of a world where the greatest worry was whether you'd finished your homework or if your favorite television show would be on the next night. But outside, in the darkness of Petaluma's quiet streets, someone else was moving through the night with far different intentions. Richard Allen Davis was a man whose life had been marked by violence, instability, and a growing pattern of criminal behavior that should have kept him locked away from society. At 39 years old, Davis had already compiled an extensive criminal record that painted a disturbing portrait of escalating violence and disregard for others' safety. Born in 1954, Davis had experienced a childhood marked by chaos and abuse. His parents were physically abusive, creating an environment of violence that would later manifest in his own actions. But while a difficult childhood might explain certain behaviors, it cannot excuse the choices Davis would make as an adult, choices that would destroy families and change laws. By the time October 1993 arrived, Davis had been in and out of prison multiple times. His criminal record stretched back to the 1970s and included a disturbing array of offenses: burglary, assault, and most troublingly, kidnapping. He had served time for previous kidnapping offenses, crimes that should have marked him as extremely dangerous to society. Yet due to various factors in the criminal justice system, overcrowding, plea bargains, and perhaps a lack of understanding about the nature of repeat violent offenders, Davis had been released on parole. On the night of October 1st, Davis was supposedly visiting his estranged mother in the area, though his true motivations for being in Petaluma that night remain unclear. What is clear is that he had been drinking, and alcohol had always been a factor that seemed to remove whatever thin barriers existed between Davis and his violent impulses. As he moved through the quiet residential streets of Petaluma, Davis was looking for an opportunity. He was a predator in the truest sense of the word, someone who sought out vulnerability and weakness to exploit. The peaceful neighborhood, with its unlocked doors and trusting residents, presented exactly the kind of environment where someone like Davis could operate. Somehow, Davis found his way to the Kloss home on 4th Street. The details of how he selected this particular house, or whether it was random, remain part of the mystery that would haunt investigators. What we know is that he managed to enter the house, moving through it with the confidence of someone who had done this before. Davis made his way to the kitchen, where he armed himself with a knife from the family's own cutlery. This detail would later prove significant to investigators and prosecutors. it showed premeditation and planning, even if the specific target hadn't been predetermined. He wasn't carrying a weapon when he entered, he was prepared to use whatever he found to accomplish his goals. With the knife in hand, Davis moved through the house toward the sounds of the girls' voices. He could hear them in Polly's bedroom, playing their board game, completely unaware that danger was approaching. In their innocent 12-year-old world, the idea that a stranger could enter their home with violent intentions was simply beyond imagination. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Davis entered Polly's bedroom. The three girls looked up from their game to see a stranger standing in the doorway, a disheveled, intoxicated man holding a knife. The contrast between their world of childhood games and the reality of this moment must have been jarring beyond comprehension. Davis, perhaps recognizing the need to control the situation quickly, told the girls not to be afraid. He claimed he was only there for money, attempting to present himself as a burglar rather than something far more sinister. This lie was likely meant to keep the girls calm and prevent them from screaming or trying to escape. Moving with practiced efficiency, Davis tied up Polly's two friends, binding their hands and feet with materials he found in the room. He then pulled pillowcases over their heads, effectively blinding them and preventing them from seeing what would happen next. His instructions to them were specific and chilling. They were to count to 1,000 before doing anything else. With Polly's friends secured and temporarily incapacitated, Davis turned his attention to his real target. He grabbed Polly and forced her to come with him, threatening her with the knife to ensure her compliance. For a 12-year-old girl, suddenly faced with a violent stranger in her own bedroom, the terror must have been overwhelming. Davis led Polly out of the house and into the night, leaving her two friends tied up in the bedroom, counting to 1,000 as instructed, not yet fully comprehending what had just occurred. In the adjacent bedroom, Polly's mother continued to sleep, unaware that her daughter had just been taken from their home by a stranger. It would be the last time anyone would see Polly Klaus alive. The friends, after completing their count, managed to free themselves and immediately ran to wake Eve Nickel. The terror in their voices and the empty space where Polly should have been told the story clearly, something terrible had happened. Eve called 911, her voice breaking as she tried to explain to the dispatcher that her daughter had been kidnapped from their home. Within 30 minutes of the kidnapping, law enforcement had issued an all-points bulletin with the suspect's description provided by Polly's friends. The girls had shown remarkable composure and attention to detail despite their trauma, providing investigators with crucial information about the man who had taken their friend. The description went out over the radio: a white male, approximately 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet tall, with long hair and a scruffy beard. He appeared to be intoxicated and was wearing dark clothing. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. However, there was a critical flaw in the communication system that night. The APB was broadcast only over Sonoma County Sheriff's radio frequency. Law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties didn't receive the alert, creating a gap in coverage that would prove significant. As news of the kidnapping spread through Petaluma, the community's response was immediate and overwhelming. This was every parent's worst nightmare made real: a child taken from her own home, from what should have been the safest place in the world. Neighbors, friends, and complete strangers began organizing search efforts. The Polly Klaus Foundation was quickly established to coordinate the search and provide support for the family. Mark Klaus, Polly's father, became the public face of the search effort. His passionate pleas for his daughter's safe return were broadcast on television stations across the country. The image of this grieving father, desperately seeking any information about his missing daughter, touched hearts nationwide and brought unprecedented attention to the case. The search for Polly Klaus became one of the largest missing child investigations in California history. Volunteers came from across the state to help search the rolling hills and dense forests of Sonoma County. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing federal resources to bear on the case. Celebrities and politicians offered rewards for information. The entire nation seemed to be watching and hoping for Polly's safe return. But even as thousands of volunteers combed the countryside, Davis was moving through the area undetected. His familiarity with the region's back roads and rural areas, gained through years of criminal activity, served him well. He knew where to go to avoid detection, where he could dispose of evidence, and how to blend into the landscape. The investigation took an unexpected turn on October 19, when Davis was arrested in nearby Ukiah for driving under the influence. This arrest occurred just 18 days after Polly's kidnapping, but at the time, investigators had no reason to connect Davis to the case. He was processed, released, and told to appear in court at a later date. He would fail to appear for that court date, adding another warrant to his growing list of legal troubles. On November 30, Davis was arrested again, this time for violating his parole. The violation was related to his failure to appear in court for the DUI charge, but it was enough to put him back in custody. It was during this arrest that investigators began to take a closer look at Richard Allen Davis. Someone in law enforcement had noticed that Davis matched the general description of the Polly Klaas kidnapper. His height, build, and appearance were consistent with what the witnesses had described. More importantly, he had been in the Petaluma area on the night of the kidnapping, and his criminal history included previous kidnapping offenses. The breakthrough in the case came from forensic evidence. Investigators had collected fingerprints from various locations in the Klaas home, hoping to find trace evidence left by the intruder. Among these prints was a palm print found on Polly's bedroom door frame, exactly where someone might place their hand while entering the room. When Davis was processed for his parole violation, his fingerprints and palm prints were taken as part of standard booking procedures. The comparison process was painstaking, but eventually, forensic experts made a match. The palm print from Polly's bedroom door frame belonged to Richard Allen Davis. This was the evidence investigators needed to formally name Davis as their primary suspect. On December 3, 1993, Davis was charged with Polly's kidnapping. But Polly herself was still missing, and investigators knew that finding her remained their most important task. With Davis in custody, investigators began the process of trying to get him to reveal Polly's location. Davis initially denied any involvement in the kidnapping, maintaining his innocence despite the physical evidence linking him to the scene. But as the questioning continued, and as investigators presented him with the evidence against him, Davis's resolve began to weaken. The interrogation of Richard Allen Davis was a delicate process. Investigators knew that their primary goal was not necessarily to get a confession, but to find out what had happened to Polly. If there was any chance she was still alive, time was of the absolute essence. Every hour that passed reduced the likelihood of finding her safe. Davis was an experienced criminal who understood the legal system. He knew his rights, he knew how interrogations worked, and he knew that anything he said could be used against him in court. But he also seemed to understand that the evidence against him was overwhelming, and that his best chance might be to cooperate with authorities. On December 4, 1993, more than 2 months after Polly's disappearance, Davis finally agreed to lead investigators to where he had hidden her body. It was a moment that brought both resolution and heartbreak to everyone involved in the case. Davis directed investigators to a remote area of thick woodland in Cloverdale, about 30 miles from Petaluma. The location was off Highway 101, in an area so secluded that Polly's body might never have been found without Davis's confession. He had covered her remains with branches and debris, attempting to conceal the evidence of his crime. The discovery of Polly's body confirmed what many had feared but no one had wanted to accept, that she had been murdered shortly after her kidnapping. The medical examiner determined that she had been strangled to death, likely within hours of being taken from her home. This meant that while thousands of volunteers were searching the countryside, while her parents were making desperate pleas on television, while the entire nation was hoping for her safe return, Polly had already been dead. The revelation was devastating for everyone who had held out hope for Polly's survival. For her parents, Mark and Eve, it meant the end of 2 months of agonizing uncertainty, but it also meant confronting the terrible reality that their daughter was never coming home. For the volunteers who had searched tirelessly, it meant that all their efforts, while well-intentioned, had been in vain. For the investigators, it meant that their focus would now shift from rescue to justice. The evidence against Richard Allen Davis was overwhelming. In addition to the palm print found in Polly's bedroom, investigators had witnessed testimony from Polly's friends, who had seen Davis and could identify him. They had evidence of his presence in the area on the night of the kidnapping, his criminal history that showed a pattern of similar offenses, and ultimately, his confession to the location of Polly's body. Davis was formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, burglary, and attempted lewd act on a child. The combination of charges made him eligible for the death penalty under California law. The case would take several years to come to trial, as both the prosecution and defense prepared their arguments. The trial of Richard Allen Davis began in 1996, nearly 3 years after Polly's murder. The prosecution, led by experienced district attorneys, presented a methodical case that walked the jury through every aspect of the crime. They showed how Davis had entered the Kloss home, how he had terrorized 3 12-year-old girls, how he had kidnapped Polly, and how he had murdered her. The defense faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against Davis was overwhelming, and there were few mitigating factors they could present to the jury. Davis's criminal history made it difficult to argue that this was an aberrant act, and the nature of the crime itself, kidnapping and murdering a child, was exactly the kind of offense that tends to galvanize juries toward the harshest possible punishment. Throughout the trial, Polly's family and friends filled the courtroom, providing a constant reminder of the human cost of Davis's actions. Mark Kloss became a powerful advocate for victims' rights, using his daughter's case to highlight the flaws in the criminal justice system that had allowed someone like Davis to be free to commit such a heinous crime. The trial also revealed disturbing details about Davis's behavior and mindset. Expert witnesses testified about his psychological profile, his history of violence, and his lack of remorse for his actions. It became clear that Davis was exactly the kind of predator that parents fear most, someone who sought out vulnerable victims and had no regard for human life or suffering. On June 18, 1996, after deliberating for just a few hours, the jury found Richard Allen Davis guilty on all counts. The conviction was never really in doubt, given the overwhelming evidence against him. The question that remained was whether he would receive the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the penalty phase of the trial, the prosecution presented evidence of Davis's lengthy criminal history and the particularly heinous nature of his crime against Polly. They argued that he represented exactly the kind of offender for whom the death penalty was intended, someone whose crimes were so terrible and who posed such a continued threat to society that the ultimate punishment was justified. The defense attempted to present mitigating factors, including Davis's difficult childhood and his struggles with alcohol and substance abuse. They argued that these factors, while not excusing his actions, should be considered when determining his sentence. But the jury was unmoved by these arguments. On August 5, 1996, they recommended that Richard Allen Davis be sentenced to death. The judge accepted the jury's recommendation, formally sentencing Davis to death by lethal injection. Even in this final moment, Davis showed his true character. Rather than expressing remorse for his actions or acknowledging the pain he had caused, he made an obscene gesture toward the courtroom, showing his contempt for the judicial process and his complete lack of empathy for his victims. The Polly Kloss case had ramifications that extended far beyond the courtroom. The murder of this innocent 12-year-old girl became a catalyst for significant changes in the American criminal justice system, particularly regarding repeat offenders and child protection. Most notably, Polly's case was instrumental in the passage of California's 3 strikes law in 1994. This legislation mandated that defendants with 2 prior serious felony convictions receive a sentence of 25 years to life for any third felony conviction. The law was designed to keep repeat offenders like Davis in prison permanently, preventing them from having the opportunity to commit additional crimes. The case also led to improvements in communication systems between law enforcement agencies, addressing the problem that had occurred on the night of Polly's kidnapping when the APB didn't reach all relevant jurisdictions. The development of more sophisticated alert systems, including what would eventually become the Amber Alert system, can trace their origins partly to lessons learned from Polly's case. Mark Kloss became a national advocate for victims' rights and child safety. He founded the Kloss Kids Foundation, which works to prevent crimes against children and to improve the response when children do go missing. His advocacy has led to numerous improvements in how law enforcement handles missing child cases and how communities can work together to protect their children. The case also highlighted the importance of children's ability to provide accurate information to law enforcement. Polly's two friends, despite their trauma, were able to provide crucial details about Davis's appearance and behavior. This led to improved training for investigators on how to interview child witnesses and victims. As we near the end of this story, it's important to remember that while justice was served in the legal sense, nothing could truly compensate for the loss of Polly Kloss. She was a bright, spirited young girl whose life was cut short by a man who had already shown society that he was dangerous and violent. Richard Allen Davis remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California, more than 25 years after his conviction. California's lengthy appeals process and the state's moratorium on executions mean that his sentence has not been carried out, and it may never be. In recent years, his attorneys have made various attempts to have his sentence overturned or commuted, but as of now, he remains condemned to death for his crimes. The house on 4th Street in Petaluma where Polly was kidnapped has changed hands several times over the years. The community has worked to heal from the trauma of what happened there, but the memory of that October night in 1993 remains part of the town's history. Polly Kloss would have been in her 40s now, had she lived. We can only imagine what kind of woman she might have become, what contributions she might have made to the world, what kind of family she might have had. These are the questions that have no answers, the dreams that were stolen along with her life. Her legacy lives on through the changes her case brought about in the criminal justice system, through the work of the foundations established in her memory, and through the increased awareness of child safety that her tragedy helped create. Every Amber Alert that helps find a missing child, every repeat offender who is kept in prison because of three strikes laws, every improvement in how law enforcement handles these cases, all of these can be traced, in part, to the lessons learned from Polly's case. The story of Polly Kloss is ultimately a story about the vulnerability of innocence in a world where evil exists. It's about a little girl who should have been safe in her own home, having a sleepover with her friends, but who encountered a man whose criminal justice system had failed to contain. It's about parents who did everything right but couldn't protect their child from a threat they never saw coming. But it's also a story about a community that came together in the face of tragedy, about parents who turned their grief into advocacy for other children, and about a criminal justice system that learned from its failures and worked to do better. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Polly Kloss not just as the victim of a terrible crime, but as a spirited 12-year-old girl who loved sleepovers with her friends, who had dreams and plans for her future, and whose brief life had an impact that continues to this day. Her story reminds us of the importance of protecting the innocent, of the value of community, and of the ongoing work needed to make our world a safer place for all children. In a case that began with such darkness, perhaps the most important lesson is that light can emerge from even the most terrible circumstances, not to diminish the tragedy, but to ensure that some good can come from senseless loss. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we journey to the quiet hills of Carter County, Tennessee, where beneath the surface of small-town life, a darkness was brewing that would shock a community and reveal the depths of human deception. This is the story of Edward Elliott, a 64-year-old man whose disappearance would lead investigators down a twisted path of betrayal, violence, and ultimately, a discovery so disturbing it would haunt everyone involved. So let me tell you about a case that reminds us that sometimes the most ordinary places hide the most extraordinary secrets. Edward Elliot was the kind of man who lived quietly but left an impression. At 64, he had weathered the storms of life with the resilience that often comes from growing up in rural Tennessee. Those who knew him described him as someone who kept to himself mostly, but was always willing to lend a hand when needed. He had his routines, his familiar places, and his small circle of acquaintances in Carter County. But sometime in late January or early February of 2024, Edward Elliot simply vanished from his world. At first, his absence wasn't immediately alarming. People go away for a while, visit family, take care of business elsewhere. In small communities, it's not unusual for someone to be gone for days or even weeks without much fanfare. But as February turned to March, and March began to wear on, those who knew Edward began to feel an uncomfortable stirring of concern. By late March, that concern had crystallized into something more urgent. Edward Elliot was officially reported missing. The man who had lived his quiet life in the hills of Tennessee had simply disappeared, leaving behind more questions than answers. Law enforcement began their investigation with the usual protocols. They spoke to neighbors, checked his last known whereabouts, examined his home for signs of struggle or sudden departure. But the trail seemed to go cold almost immediately. Edward Elliot had seemingly evaporated from existence, leaving behind only the growing worry of those who cared about him and the mounting frustration of investigators who found themselves chasing shadows. Little did anyone know that the truth was literally buried, waiting in a place so ordinary, so mundane, that it would be months before anyone thought to look there. Spring arrived in Carter County with its usual beauty, but for those investigating Edward Elliot's disappearance, the season brought only more questions. Detective work in missing person cases often involves a delicate balance between hope and harsh reality. In the early days, there's always the possibility that the person will simply return, with a reasonable explanation for their absence. But as time passes, that hope begins to transform into something darker. The investigators worked methodically through Edward's life, trying to piece together his final days. They spoke to shopkeepers who might have seen him, friends who might have heard from him, anyone who might provide a clue about where he had gone or what had happened to him. The picture that emerged was of a man living a relatively simple life, without obvious enemies or dangerous entanglements. But in any investigation, there are always names that come up repeatedly, people who were in the victim's orbit, who had contact with them in those final days. And in Edward Elliot's case, several names began to surface with increasing frequency. Joey Lee Gwynn was 46 years old and lived on Mike Clausen Road in Hampton, a small community within Carter County. Those who knew Gwynn described him as someone who moved through life with a certain intensity, someone who could be charming when he wanted to be, but who also carried an undercurrent of unpredictability that made people cautious around him. Then there was Jim Chambers, 37 years old, another figure in the loose network of people who had crossed paths with Edward Elliot in those final weeks. Chambers was known to law enforcement, though not necessarily for anything major. He was the kind of person who seemed to drift through life, making connections, and then moving on, leaving behind a trail of complicated relationships and unfinished business. As the investigation progressed, these names kept appearing in witness statements and interviews. Both men had been in contact with Edward Elliot in the weeks before his disappearance. Both had been seen in his company. And both, according to various witnesses, had been involved in some kind of business dealings with the missing man. But knowing someone was in contact with a missing person and proving they were responsible for their disappearance are two very different things. The investigators needed more than suspicion and witness statements. They needed evidence. They needed proof. And proof, as it turned out, was buried deeper than anyone could have imagined. May 15, 2024, started like any other spring day in Carter County. The weather was warming, the trees were fully green, and life in the rural Tennessee community was following its usual rhythms. But by the end of that day, everything would change for everyone involved in the Edward Elliot case. Sometimes the most shocking discoveries come not from dramatic raids or high-tech investigations, but from the most mundane of circumstances. Someone notices something out of place. A neighbor mentioned something odd. A routine check reveals something that shouldn't be there. On that May afternoon, investigators found themselves at a property that had come up in their ongoing investigation. It was the kind of place that might easily be overlooked, not particularly remarkable, not obviously connected to anything sinister. Just another piece of rural Tennessee landscape. But as they began to examine the area more carefully, something caught their attention. The ground showed signs of recent disturbance. The earth had been moved, shaped, in a way that didn't look natural. And there was something else, something that looked distinctly artificial buried beneath the surface. What they found that day would haunt everyone present. Buried in the ground was a freezer. Not just any freezer, but one that had been carefully concealed, deliberately hidden from view. And inside that freezer was the answer to the question that had been plaguing investigators for months. Edward Elliot had been found. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team and the community. This wasn't a case of someone wandering off and meeting with an accident. This wasn't a situation where someone had chosen to disappear on their own. This was murder, and not just any murder, but one that had been planned and executed with a chilling level of premeditation. The fact that Edward's body had been placed in a freezer and then buried suggested a level of calculation that was deeply disturbing. Someone had not only killed him but had taken elaborate steps to hide the evidence, to make him disappear completely. It was the kind of crime that spoke to a cold, methodical mind capable of both violence and careful planning. As the reality of the discovery sank in, the investigation shifted into high gear. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a homicide investigation, and the evidence suggested that the perpetrators were still out there, possibly believing they had gotten away with the perfect crime. The discovery of Edward Elliot's body transformed the entire investigation. What had been a frustrating search for a missing person suddenly became a focused hunt for killers. And with that shift came new urgency, new resources, and new determination to bring those responsible to justice. The forensic examination of the scene and the body would take time, but investigators already had leads to pursue. The names that had been surfacing throughout the missing person investigation, Joey Gwynn and Jim Chambers, suddenly took on new significance. These weren't just people who had known the victim, they were potential suspects in his murder. But building a case against them would require more than suspicion. It would require evidence, witnesses, and proof of their involvement in Edward's death. And as investigators dug deeper into the lives and activities of these two men, a picture began to emerge of what might have happened in those final days of Edward Elliot's life. Joey Gwynn, they discovered, had been living what appeared to be a relatively ordinary life in Hampton. But appearances, as investigators knew well, could be deceiving. As they examined his recent activities, his associations, and his movements around the time of Edward's disappearance, patterns began to emerge that suggested he was far more involved in Edward's fate than he had initially claimed. Jim Chambers presented a different kind of challenge. Unlike Gwynn, who had remained in the area, Chambers seemed to have a habit of moving around, of not staying in one place for too long. This mobility made him harder to track, harder to pin down, but it also suggested a certain awareness of law enforcement attention that was itself suspicious. As May turned into June, the investigation began to focus on finding and arresting these two men. But Chambers, it seemed, had already recognized the danger he was in. By the time investigators were ready to move on him, he had disappeared, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that he was running from something. The hunt for Jim Chambers would lead investigators far from the hills of Tennessee, to places where a man might think he could disappear and start over. But in the modern world, truly disappearing is much harder than it used to be. Electronic footprints, security cameras, and interconnected law enforcement databases make it difficult for anyone to simply vanish. And Jim Chambers, as investigators would soon discover, had made some choices about where to run that would ultimately make their job much easier. While investigators in Carter County worked to build their case against Joey Gwynn, who remained in the area, a different kind of investigation was unfolding to track down Jim Chambers. The 37-year-old suspect had apparently recognized that the discovery of Edward Elliott's body made his situation precarious, and he had chosen to run rather than face questioning. But running from a murder investigation in the 21st century is a complex undertaking. It requires not just the ability to physically disappear, but also the knowledge and resources to avoid the many ways that modern law enforcement can track a person's movements. Credit card usage, cell phone signals, security camera footage, and simple human recognition all create a web that makes true invisibility nearly impossible. Chambers had apparently decided that distance was his best defense. Rather than trying to hide somewhere local, where he might be recognized and reported, he had headed south, far from Tennessee, to a place where he might blend in among the crowds and chaos of a major city. New Orleans, Louisiana, is the kind of place where someone might think they could disappear. It's a city with a transient population, a place where strangers are common and questions aren't always asked. The French Quarter, the various neighborhoods spreading out from the Mississippi River, the constant flow of tourists and temporary residents, all of this might seem like perfect cover for someone trying to avoid law enforcement attention. But Chambers had made a crucial mistake. He hadn't run alone. Amanda Brooke Quillen was 30 years old and from Hampton, Tennessee, the same small community where Joey Gwynn lived, the same area where Edward Elliott had disappeared. Her connection to the case wasn't immediately clear, but her decision to accompany Jim Chambers in his flight from Tennessee suggested that she knew more about the situation than might initially appear. Whether Quillen was romantically involved with Chambers, simply caught up in the situation, or actively complicit in the crimes would become clearer as the investigation progressed. But her presence with Chambers as he fled Tennessee added another layer of complexity to the case and suggested that the network of people involved in Edward Elliott's death might be larger than initially suspected. On May 24, 2024, just over a week after Edward's body had been discovered, law enforcement officers in New Orleans located and arrested both Jim Chambers and Amanda Quillen. The arrest brought Chambers' attempt at escape to an end and added a new suspect to the growing list of people believed to be involved in the case. The extradition process would bring both back to Tennessee to face the consequences of their alleged actions. But their arrest in Louisiana raised new questions about the scope of the conspiracy and the exact role each person had played in Edward Elliott's death. With Jim Chambers and Amanda Quillen back in Carter County, investigators had all the main players in custody and could begin to piece together the full scope of what had happened to Edward Elliott. But as they dug deeper into the relationships and activities of those involved, a complex picture emerged of motivations, opportunities, and the kind of small-town dynamics that can sometimes turn deadly. Joey Gwynn, the 46-year-old who lived on Mike Clausen Road in Hampton, was charged with first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. The charges painted a picture of someone who wasn't just involved in Edward's death, but who had played a central role in both the killing and the elaborate cover-up that followed. Jim Chambers faced similar charges: first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. His decision to flee to Louisiana suggested consciousness of guilt, but it also indicated that he understood the serious nature of the evidence against him. Amanda Quillen's charges were different but no less serious. She was accused of being an accessory after the fact to first-degree murder, which meant that while she might not have been directly involved in Edward's killing, she had allegedly helped the perpetrators avoid justice after the crime was committed. But there was more. She was also charged with coercion or persuasion of a witness, a charge that suggested she had actively tried to prevent someone from cooperating with the investigation. This additional charge came from text messages that investigators had discovered. Quillen had apparently sent messages to someone named Hobbs, warning her that Gwynn knew she was talking to others about the crime. It was exactly the kind of evidence that prosecutors love: direct proof of an attempt to obstruct justice and intimidate witnesses. But who was Hobbs, and what did she know about Edward Elliott's death? As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that there had been witnesses to at least part of what had happened to Edward. People who had seen things, heard things, known things that could help piece together the final moments of Edward Elliott's life. The picture that emerged from these witness statements was disturbing. According to testimony that would later be heard in court, witnesses had seen Edward Elliot being beaten by the men who were now charged with his murder. It wasn't a quick, impulsive killing, but something more prolonged, more deliberate. The details of exactly what happened in those final hours of Edward's life would emerge during the court proceedings, but the witness statements suggested a level of violence and cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators. As the case moved through the court system, more details emerged about the relationships between the victim and his alleged killers. Edward Elliot, it seemed, had become entangled with Joey Gwynn and Jim Chambers through some kind of business dealings or personal connections that had gone tragically wrong. The exact nature of their relationship remained somewhat murky, as is often the case in small-town crimes where everyone knows everyone else, and relationships can be complex and multifaceted. But what became clear was that whatever had brought these men together had ultimately led to a situation where violence became the chosen solution to whatever problem they faced. The preliminary hearings in the case provided glimpses into the prosecution's theory of what had happened. Witnesses testified about seeing Edward Elliot being beaten. The evidence of the buried freezer suggested premeditation and a calculated effort to hide the crime. The flight of Chambers and the attempts by Quillen to intimidate witnesses indicated consciousness of guilt and active efforts to obstruct justice. But perhaps most disturbing was the timeline that emerged. Edward Elliot had last been seen in late January or early February. His body wasn't discovered until May 15th. That meant that for months, while his family and friends worried about his disappearance, while investigators searched for clues to his whereabouts, his killers were living their lives, going about their daily routines, all while knowing exactly where he was and what had happened to him. The psychological profile that emerged from this timeline was chilling. These weren't people who had killed in a moment of passion and then panicked. These were individuals who had committed murder and then had the cold-blooded calculation to hide the evidence so thoroughly that it took months for the body to be discovered. And during all that time, they had said nothing, done nothing to help the investigation, and had watched as Edward's loved ones suffered through the agony of not knowing what had happened to him. Joey Gwynn's bond was set at an enormous $5 million, reflecting the serious nature of the charges and perhaps the flight risk he was considered to pose. Jim Chambers and Amanda Quillen also faced substantial bonds, though theirs were somewhat lower, reflecting their different levels of alleged involvement in the crime. As the cases moved toward trial, the prosecution began preparing to present their evidence to a jury. But they knew that proving beyond a reasonable doubt exactly what had happened in those final days of Edward Elliot's life would be challenging. Witness testimony, physical evidence, and circumstantial proof would all have to come together to paint a convincing picture of guilt. The legal proceedings in the Edward Elliot case would unfold slowly, as complex murder cases often do. Each defendant faced different charges reflecting their alleged level of involvement, and each would require separate consideration by the court system. For Joey Gwynn, facing charges of first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence, the potential consequences were severe. First-degree murder in Tennessee carries the possibility of life in prison or even the death penalty, depending on the circumstances and the prosecution's decisions about how to proceed. Jim Chambers faced identical charges, and his attempt to flee the jurisdiction would likely be seen by prosecutors as evidence of consciousness of guilt. His decision to run to Louisiana and his subsequent arrest there would become part of the narrative that prosecutors would present to a jury about his awareness of his own culpability. Amanda Quillen's situation was somewhat different. Her charges of accessory after the fact and coercion of a witness were serious, but they didn't carry the same potential penalties as the murder charges faced by Gwynn and Chambers. However, her alleged attempts to intimidate witnesses suggested an active role in the cover-up that went beyond simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The prosecution's case would rely heavily on witness testimony, physical evidence from the burial site, and the electronic evidence like the text messages Quillen had sent trying to intimidate potential witnesses. But perhaps most importantly, they would need to convince a jury that the elaborate nature of the cover-up, the burial of the body in a freezer, the months of silence while the investigation proceeded, the flight of Chambers to Louisiana, all pointed to guilty knowledge and active participation in Edward Elliot's death. The defense attorneys for each defendant would face the challenging task of creating reasonable doubt in the face of what appeared to be overwhelming evidence. They would need to question the reliability of witness testimony, challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the physical evidence, and perhaps most difficult of all, provide alternative explanations for their client's behavior after Edward's death. As the case moved toward trial, the community of Carter County watched and waited. The discovery of Edward Elliott's body buried in a freezer had shocked the area, but the arrests and charges had provided some sense that justice was being pursued. Still, many questions remained unanswered. As investigators continued to piece together the events surrounding Edward Elliott's death, a clearer picture began to emerge of the relationships and motivations that had led to tragedy. Small-town crimes often have roots that go deeper than the immediate circumstances of the violence, and the Elliott case appeared to be no exception. The business dealings or personal connections that had brought Edward Elliott into the orbit of Joey Gwynn and Jim Chambers remained somewhat mysterious, but witness statements and investigation suggested that there had been ongoing tensions or disputes that had escalated beyond what anyone might have expected. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the level of premeditation suggested by the evidence. The decision to bury Edward's body in a freezer wasn't something done in a moment of panic after an unplanned killing. It required planning, preparation, and a cold-blooded calculation about how to hide evidence of the crime. This suggested that either the killing itself had been planned well in advance, or that the perpetrators had been able to shift very quickly from committing murder to methodically covering it up. Either possibility painted a picture of individuals capable of a level of calculation and emotional detachment that was deeply unsettling. The role of Amanda Quillen in the aftermath of the crime also suggested that the network of people involved in the cover-up extended beyond just the alleged killers. Her charges of being an accessory after the fact and attempting to intimidate witnesses indicated that she had actively participated in trying to prevent justice from being served. The text message she had sent to Hobbs, warning that Gwynn knew she was talking about the crime, revealed the existence of witnesses who had knowledge about what had happened but were being pressured to remain silent. This kind of witness intimidation is particularly troubling because it suggests an organized effort to obstruct justice and prevent the truth from coming to light. For the investigators working the case, each new piece of evidence raised as many questions as it answered. How long had Edward Elliott been in danger before his death? Had there been opportunities to prevent the tragedy if someone had spoken up earlier? How many people in the community had suspected something but remained silent? These questions might never be fully answered, but they highlighted one of the most troubling aspects of crimes like this, the way they can spread their poison through entire communities, creating fear, suspicion, and a sense that nowhere is truly safe. As the Edward Elliott case moved through the court system, it served as a stark reminder of how quickly lives can be destroyed and communities can be shattered by violence. Edward Elliott had been living his quiet life in Carter County, probably never imagining that his routine interactions with acquaintances could lead to his death and the destruction of multiple families. The ripple effects of his murder extended far beyond the immediate participants. His family and friends were left to grapple not only with their loss but with the horrific circumstances of his death. The families of the accused faced their own kind of devastation as they watched loved ones charged with terrible crimes. The community of Carter County, meanwhile, had to confront the reality that this level of violence and calculation had been present in their midst, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. The discovery of Edward's body buried in a freezer was the kind of revelation that changes how people think about their neighbors, their safety, and their community. For law enforcement, the case represented both a success and a sobering reminder of the challenges they face. They had ultimately solved the case and brought the alleged perpetrators to justice, but it had taken months, and Edward Elliott had been dead the entire time they were searching for him as a missing person. The preliminary hearings provided glimpses of the testimony and evidence that would eventually be presented at trial. Witnesses described seeing Edward Elliott being beaten by the men now charged with his murder. The physical evidence of the buried freezer spoke to premeditation and cover-up. The flight of Jim Chambers to Louisiana and the text messages from Amanda Quillen attempting to intimidate witnesses painted a picture of guilty knowledge and active obstruction of justice. But trials are unpredictable, and the defense attorneys would have opportunities to challenge the prosecution's narrative, to question the reliability of witnesses, and to raise doubts about their client's guilt. The families of the accused would undoubtedly maintain their loved one's innocence, and the legal process would need to run its course before any final judgments could be made. As we reach the end of Edward Elliott's story, we're left with the kinds of questions that true crime cases often raise but rarely answer completely. What drives ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence? How do communities heal after being confronted with such darkness in their midst? What can be learned from tragedies like this that might prevent future ones? Edward Elliott was 64 years old when his life was cut short. He had lived through decades of changes in his community, had weathered personal storms and celebrations, had built relationships and made his quiet mark on the world around him. His death represented not just the loss of one man, but the destruction of all the potential experiences, relationships, and contributions he might have made in the years he should have had ahead of him. The charges against Joey Gwynn, Jim Chambers, and Amanda Quillen reflected the prosecution's theory that this had been not just a murder, but a calculated effort to make Edward Elliott disappear completely. The burial of his body in a freezer, the months of silence while investigators searched for him, the attempts to intimidate witnesses, all of this suggested a level of planning and cold-bloodedness that went far beyond a crime of passion. As the legal proceedings continued, the families on all sides faced their own forms of suffering. Edward's loved ones sought justice and closure, while the families of the accused grappled with the possibility that people they cared about were capable of terrible acts. The community of Carter County, Tennessee, would eventually move on, as communities always do. But the memory of what happened to Edward Elliott would linger, a reminder that even in the quietest places, darkness can take root and grow until it explodes into violence that changes everything. In cases like this, we often look for lessons, for ways to make sense of senseless tragedy. Perhaps the lesson of Edward Elliott's story is simply that we must pay attention to the people around us, that we must take seriously the signs of trouble or danger, and that we must be willing to speak up when we see something wrong. Edward Elliott deserved better than the fate that befell him. He deserved to live out his years in peace, to die naturally when his time came, to be mourned by those who loved him rather than to become the victim of violence and deception. His story serves as a reminder that behind every true crime case is a real person whose life had value, whose death represents an irreplaceable loss, and whose memory deserves to be honored even as we try to understand how such tragedies occur. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Edward Elliott not just as a victim of crime, but as a person who lived, who mattered, and whose story, tragic as it is, reminds us of the precious fragility of life and the importance of treating each other with dignity and respect. The hills of Carter County, Tennessee, are quiet again now, but they remember. And sometimes, that's all we can ask for, that we remember, that we learn, and that we try to do better. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we journey back to the Philippines in the early 1990s, to a story that shook an entire nation and exposed the dark underbelly of political power and corruption. This is the tragic tale of two young university students whose lives were cut short by unimaginable evil, a story that would become one of the most infamous true crime cases in Philippine history. Picture, if you will, the University of the Philippines campus in Los Baños, Laguna. It's 1993, and the Philippines is slowly emerging from the shadow of the Marcos dictatorship that ended just 7 years earlier. Democracy is still fragile, and in many provinces, local politicians wield power like feudal lords, their word being law in their territories. Los Baños is a quiet university town, nestled in the shadow of Mount Makiling, where the mist rolls down from the mountains in the early morning hours. Students walk along tree-lined paths between classes, their backpacks slung over shoulders, notebooks tucked under arms, minds focused on exams, projects, and the bright futures that seem to stretch endlessly before them. Among these students were two young people whose names would soon become forever etched in the annals of Philippine criminal history, not by choice, but by tragedy. Their names were Mary Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez. Eileen Sarmenta was 21 years old, a bright and ambitious student majoring in agriculture. She had the kind of beauty that turned heads, not just physical beauty, though she certainly possessed that, but an inner radiance that came from intelligence, determination, and hope for the future. She was the type of student who asked thoughtful questions in class, who stayed late in the library researching papers, who dreamed of making a difference in the world. Eileen was also a campus journalist, working for the university newspaper. It was a role that suited her perfectly. She had a natural curiosity about the world around her, an ability to see stories where others might see only everyday events. She approached her work with the same dedication she brought to her studies, conducting interviews with a professionalism that belied her young age. Alan Gomez was her friend and fellow student. At 22, he was quiet and studious, the kind of young man who preferred books to parties, who could often be found in the campus coffee shop with his nose buried in agricultural journals. He and Eileen had developed a close friendship through their shared classes and study sessions. They were, by all accounts, innocent young people with their whole lives ahead of them. Neither of them could have imagined that their paths would cross with one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Laguna Province, or that this encounter would lead to their deaths. In the town of Calon, just a few kilometers from the university, ruled a man whose very name would eventually become synonymous with corruption and violence. Antonio Sanchez wasn't just the mayor of Calon, he was a political dynasty in his own right, a man who had built his power through a combination of charisma, intimidation, and brutality. Sanchez was in his 40s at the time, a heavy-set man with the kind of presence that filled a room. He had been mayor for several terms, and his influence extended far beyond the borders of his small town. He owned businesses, controlled jobs, and had a network of loyal followers who would do anything he asked without question. But beneath the veneer of respectability lurked something much darker. Sanchez was known for his violent temper, his treatment of women as objects for his pleasure, and his absolute belief that his power made him untouchable. He surrounded himself with armed men who served as both bodyguards and enforcers, ready to carry out his will no matter how dark or twisted it might be. It was this man's path that would tragically intersect with the lives of two innocent students on a warm summer night in June 1993. The story of what would happen on that terrible night actually began 2 years earlier, in 1991. Eileen Sarmenta, in her role as a campus journalist, had been assigned to interview Mayor Sanchez for an article in the university newspaper. It was a routine assignment, the kind of interview that student journalists conduct all the time with local officials. Eileen approached the interview with her characteristic professionalism, arriving at the mayor's office with her questions prepared and her notebook ready. She was dressed modestly, as befitted a serious journalism student conducting an official interview. Her manner was polite but formal, maintaining the professional distance that good journalists learn to establish with their subjects. But from the moment Sanchez laid eyes on Eileen, something sinister was awakened in him. Here was a young woman of extraordinary beauty, intelligent and poised, and in his twisted mind, she became an object of obsession. The interview proceeded normally from Eileen's perspective. She asked her questions, took her notes, thanked the mayor for his time, and left. For Sanchez, however, this brief encounter planted a seed that would grow into a dangerous fixation. He began making inquiries about the young journalist. Who was she? Where did she live? What was her schedule? His interest in Eileen Sarmenta was not that of a politician hoping for favorable coverage, it was the obsession of a predator who had identified his prey. Over the following 2 years, Sanchez would occasionally see Eileen around Los Baños. The university town was small enough that paths would cross naturally. Each sighting seemed to intensify his fixation. He would make comments to his associates about the beautiful student journalist, speaking of her in ways that revealed the dark nature of his thoughts. Those who knew Sanchez well recognized the signs. They had seen him become obsessed with women before, and they knew that when the mayor wanted something, or someone, he usually found a way to get it. But none of them could have predicted just how far he would be willing to go to satisfy his twisted desires. The date was June 28, 1993. It was a Monday evening, and the campus had that particular atmosphere that comes at the end of the academic day, students heading to dinner, others settling in for evening study sessions, the quiet hum of a university town transitioning from day to night. Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez had spent the evening together, likely studying or working on academic projects. The exact details of their activities that evening remained somewhat unclear, lost to time and the horror of what was to come. What we do know is that they were together, two friends going about their normal student lives, completely unaware that they were being watched. Sanchez had been planning this night for some time. His obsession with Eileen had reached a breaking point, and he had made the decision to act on his twisted desires. But this wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of lost control. This was a carefully orchestrated abduction, planned and executed with the cold precision of a military operation. The mayor had assembled a team of his most trusted and ruthless associates for this mission. These weren't random criminals off the street, they were men who had served Sanchez loyally for years, men who had committed acts of violence and intimidation on his behalf without question. Some were members of his security detail, others were simply thugs who had found profitable employment in the mayor's service. As evening fell over Los Baños, these men took their positions. They knew Eileen's routines, her usual routes around campus and town. They had been watching and waiting for the perfect opportunity, and on this night, that opportunity finally presented itself. The abduction happened quickly and efficiently, with the kind of precision that spoke to careful planning and rehearsal. Eileen and Alan were walking together when they were suddenly surrounded by armed men. There was no escape, no opportunity to run or call for help. In a matter of moments, two university students had been transformed from free young people with bright futures into captives in the hands of dangerous men. The witnesses to the abduction were few, and those who saw what happened were too terrified to intervene. The men were clearly armed and dangerous, moving with the confidence of people who knew they were above the law. They forced Eileen and Alan into a white vehicle at gunpoint, and within minutes, the students had disappeared into the night. For the kidnappers, this was just the beginning of their plan. They had succeeded in capturing their prey, but the real horror was yet to come. The vehicle carrying Eileen and Alan wound its way through the dark streets of Laguna, past sleeping houses and shuttered businesses, carrying its terrified passengers toward a fate that neither of them could have imagined in their worst nightmares. The destination was a place called Eerie's Farm, located in Barangay Curba. This was one of Sanchez's properties, a remote location where he could conduct his business away from prying eyes. It was the perfect setting for what he had planned, isolated, controlled, and absolutely private. What happened at Eerie's Farm that night was so horrific that when the details eventually came to light during the trial, they shocked even hardened court officials and journalists who had covered countless criminal cases. The farm became the scene of unspeakable acts of violence and cruelty, a place where two innocent young people endured torments that no human being should ever have to experience. Upon arrival at the farm, Eileen and Alan were bound and gagged. They were completely helpless, at the mercy of men who had none. The terror they must have felt is almost impossible to imagine, two students who had been going about their normal evening activities suddenly finding themselves prisoners in a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. Sanchez and his men had brought other people to the farm as well, individuals who would serve as witnesses to the mayor's power and brutality, though some would later become key witnesses in the prosecution's case. Among these was Aurelio Centeno, one of Sanchez's associates who would later testify about the horrors he witnessed that night. The first victim of the mayor's cruelty was Alan. While Eileen was forced to watch, Alan was brutally tortured. The methods used were designed not just to cause pain, but to maximize suffering and terror. According to later court testimony, Alan was beaten repeatedly, his body subjected to violence that served no purpose other than to satisfy the sadistic impulses of his captors. One particularly brutal detail that emerged during the trial was that Pepito Kawit, one of Sanchez's men, struck Alan in the diaphragm with the butt of an Armalite rifle. The blow was so severe that Alan fell against a cement box, his body racked with pain and struggling to breathe. When one of the other men thought Alan might be dead, Kawit reportedly said that his death would come later, indicating that the torture was far from over. The psychological torture was perhaps even worse than the physical abuse. Alan was forced to watch as the men prepared to assault Eileen, knowing that he was powerless to protect his friend. The helplessness, the terror, the knowledge of what was coming, these elements combined to create a hell on earth for both victims. What followed was an act of such barbaric cruelty that it would haunt everyone who learned of it. Eileen Sarmenta, the bright young journalism student who had once professionally interviewed a mayor for her university newspaper, became the victim of a gang rape orchestrated by that same mayor. Sanchez was the first to assault Eileen, exercising what he clearly saw as his right as the orchestrator of this horrific crime. The other men waited their turn, treating this young woman not as a human being with rights and dignity, but as an object to be used and discarded. According to court testimony, after Sanchez had finished his assault, he made a comment that revealed the casual cruelty of his nature. He told his men that he was through with Eileen, and that she was now theirs to do with as they pleased. These words, spoken so matter-of-factly, showed the complete dehumanization of the victim in the mind of her primary tormentor. Throughout this ordeal, Eileen maintained what dignity she could. Court records indicate that even in her final moments, she was begging for her life, pleading with her captors to show mercy. But mercy was something these men had abandoned long ago, if they had ever possessed it at all. The final act of cruelty came when one of the men gagged Eileen with a handkerchief to silence her pleas. She was forced to her knees, and in that position, still begging for her life, she was shot in the face. The young woman who had once asked thoughtful questions in interviews and stayed late in the library working on articles was murdered in cold blood, her life ending in terror and pain. Alan Gomez's death was no less brutal, though it came after hours of torture and the psychological torment of witnessing the assault on his friend. The young man who had preferred books to parties, who had dreamed of a career in agriculture, was shot in the head and his body thrown from the vehicle as the killers made their way back toward town. The casual manner in which Alan's life was ended, thrown from a moving vehicle like a piece of refuse, spoke to the complete lack of humanity possessed by his killers. To them, he was nothing more than an inconvenience to be disposed of, a witness who could never be allowed to survive. Both bodies were left where they fell, abandoned in the darkness of the Laguna countryside. Eileen's body was found in the back of the vehicle, naked and bearing the evidence of the terrible crimes committed against her. Alan's body was discovered along the roadside where it had been dumped. The scene that greeted investigators was one of almost unimaginable brutality. Here were two young people who had been full of life and hope just hours earlier, now reduced to crime scene evidence in what would become one of the Philippines' most notorious murder cases. When Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez failed to return to their dormitories that night, their absence was initially not cause for immediate alarm. University students sometimes stayed out late, and it wasn't unusual for them to spend nights at friends' places or in the library during exam periods. But as Tuesday morning turned to afternoon and then evening with no word from either student, concern began to grow. Friends started making calls, checking with professors and other students to see if anyone had seen Eileen or Alan. The university administration was contacted, and campus security began making inquiries. The discovery of the bodies brought the full horror of what had happened into the light. This wasn't a case of students who had simply stayed out too late or forgotten to call home. This was murder, brutal, calculated murder that bore all the hallmarks of a crime committed by people with significant resources and no fear of consequences. The Philippine National Police were called in to investigate, but from the very beginning, the case was complicated by the involvement of powerful political figures. The initial investigation was hampered by what can only be described as a lack of enthusiasm on the part of some officials who seemed more interested in protecting certain individuals than in finding the truth. But the murders of Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez were too heinous to be covered up completely. The brutality of the crimes, the innocence of the victims, and the growing evidence pointing toward official involvement created a public outcry that could not be ignored. What ultimately broke the case open was the courage of individuals who had witnessed the crimes and were willing to risk their own lives to see justice done. Chief among these was Aurelio Centeno, one of Sanchez's own associates who had been present at Eerie's farm on the night of the murders. Centeno's decision to come forward was extraordinarily brave, given that he was essentially signing his own death warrant if Sanchez and his men learned of his cooperation with authorities. But the horror of what he had witnessed apparently overcame his fear of retribution, and he agreed to testify about what he had seen. His testimony was crucial in establishing not just what had happened, but who had been responsible. Centeno could identify all the participants in the crime, describe the sequence of events, and provide details that only someone who had been present could know. His account painted a picture of calculated brutality that shocked even experienced investigators. Another key witness was Vivencio Malabanan, who also came forward with testimony about the events at Eerie's farm. Like Centeno, Malabanan was taking an enormous risk by agreeing to testify, but his conscience apparently would not allow him to remain silent about what he had witnessed. The testimony of these witnesses was corroborated by physical evidence from the crime scene and forensic analysis of the victims' bodies. Slowly but surely, investigators were able to piece together the events of that terrible night and build a case against those responsible. The case quickly became about much more than the murder of 2 university students. It became a symbol of the corruption and abuse of power that characterized much of the Philippine political system. Here was a mayor who apparently believed that his position gave him the right to kidnap, rape, and murder with impunity. The involvement of a high-ranking political figure in such heinous crimes sent shockwaves through Philippine society. People began to ask uncomfortable questions about how many other officials might be engaged in similar behavior, protected by their positions and their networks of loyal followers. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of ordinary citizens, particularly young people and women, to the predatory behavior of those in power. Eileen Sarmenta had been targeted not because of anything she had done, but simply because she had caught the attention of a powerful man who believed he could take whatever he wanted. Public pressure for justice began to mount as details of the case became known. Student organizations held rallies demanding that the perpetrators be brought to justice. Women's groups organized protests highlighting the broader issues of violence against women and abuse of power. The case became a cause célèbre, a rallying point for those demanding accountability from their political leaders. Despite his political connections and the power he wielded in Laguna Province, Antonio Sanchez could not escape the mounting evidence against him. As the investigation progressed and more witnesses came forward, it became clear that there was sufficient evidence to charge the mayor and his associates with the murders of Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez. The arrest of Sanchez was a dramatic moment that was covered extensively by the Philippine media. Here was a man who had wielded almost absolute power in his domain, now being led away in handcuffs like any common criminal. The image of the once powerful mayor being taken into custody became an iconic symbol of the principle that no one is above the law. But the arrest was only the beginning of what would prove to be a long and difficult legal battle. Sanchez had significant resources at his disposal and could afford the best legal representation available. His lawyers immediately began working to discredit the prosecution's case, challenging the credibility of witnesses and arguing that their client was being railroaded by political enemies. The trial itself was a media sensation, attracting attention not just from the Philippines but from around the world. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who wanted to see justice done for Eileen and Alan. Judge Harriet Demetriou of the Pasig City Regional Trial Court presided over the proceedings. She would later describe the case as involving a plot seemingly hatched in hell, a characterization that captured the sheer evil of the crimes that had been committed. During the 16-month trial, prosecutors presented a comprehensive case against Sanchez and his co-conspirators. The evidence included not just the testimony of witnesses like Centeno and Malabanan, but also forensic evidence from the crime scene and the victims' bodies. The prosecution was able to establish a clear timeline of events, showing how the abduction had been planned and executed, how the victims had been transported to Eerie's farm, and what had happened there. They demonstrated that this wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated series of crimes that had been planned and executed by a group of individuals led by the mayor. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence was the testimony of Centeno, who described in detail the conversations he had heard between Sanchez and his men during the commission of the crimes. These conversations revealed the casual cruelty of the perpetrators and their complete lack of remorse for what they were doing. The defense attempted to discredit the prosecution's witnesses, arguing that they were unreliable and had been coerced into giving false testimony. They suggested that the witnesses had their own criminal backgrounds and were therefore not credible. They also argued that the intense media coverage of the case had made it impossible for their clients to receive a fair trial. But the weight of evidence against Sanchez and his associates was overwhelming. The testimony of multiple witnesses was consistent and was corroborated by physical evidence. The prosecution was able to demonstrate not just that the crimes had been committed, but that these specific individuals had been responsible for them. On March 14, 1995, after 16 months of proceedings, Judge Demetriou delivered her verdict. In a 132-page decision that left no doubt about her feelings regarding the case, she found Antonio Sanchez and his co-conspirators guilty of the rape and murder of Eileen Sarmenta and the murder of Alan Gomez. The judge sentenced Sanchez to 7 terms of reclusion perpetua, life imprisonment, for his role in the crimes. His associates received similar sentences, reflecting the court's finding that they had all participated in this conspiracy of evil. In her written decision, Judge Demetriou didn't mince words about the nature of the crimes that had been committed. She described the case as involving acts of such depravity that they challenged one's faith in human nature. Her language reflected not just the legal findings of the court, but the moral outrage that these crimes had generated throughout Philippine society. The verdict was met with celebration by those who had fought for justice for Eileen and Alan. Students at the University of the Philippines held rallies celebrating the convictions, while women's groups hailed the verdicts as a victory for all victims of violence and abuse of power. But the legal battle was far from over. Sanchez and his associates immediately appealed their convictions to the Philippine Supreme Court, beginning another phase of the legal proceedings that would drag on for additional years. The appeals process in the Sanchez case was lengthy and complex, involving detailed legal arguments about everything from the admissibility of evidence to the credibility of witnesses. Sanchez's legal team continued to argue that their client had not received a fair trial and that the evidence against him was insufficient to support the convictions. The case eventually reached the Philippine Supreme Court, where it was designated as GR numbers 121,039-45. The High Court's review of the case was thorough, examining not just the legal issues raised by the defense, but also the broader implications of the case for the Philippine justice system. In their decision, the Supreme Court justices upheld the lower court's findings, affirming the convictions of Sanchez and his associates. The High Court found that the evidence presented at trial had been sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and that the defendants had received a fair trial despite the extensive media coverage. The Supreme Court's decision represented the final word on the criminal case, confirming that Antonio Sanchez and his co-conspirators would spend the rest of their lives in prison for their crimes. But even this wasn't the end of the story, as the case would continue to generate controversy and attention for years to come. In addition to the criminal proceedings, the families of Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez filed civil cases seeking damages for the wrongful deaths of their children. These cases sought to hold Sanchez and his associates financially responsible for the harm they had caused, above and beyond the criminal penalties they were serving. The civil proceedings were less dramatic than the criminal trial, but they were no less important to the families of the victims. These cases represented an opportunity to obtain some measure of compensation for their losses, though no amount of money could truly compensate for the loss of their children. The courts awarded substantial damages to both families, including actual damages totaling over 3 million pesos for each family, as well as moral damages of 2 million pesos each. The awards also included attorneys' fees and litigation expenses, reflecting the court's recognition of the significant costs associated with pursuing justice in this case. While the monetary awards were substantial, they represented much more than just financial compensation. They were a formal recognition by the judicial system of the harm that had been done and the responsibility of the perpetrators to make amends for their crimes. The Sarmenta Gomez case had implications that extended far beyond the specific crimes that had been committed. It became a symbol of the struggle against corruption and abuse of power in the Philippines, and it demonstrated that even the most powerful political figures could be held accountable for their actions. The case also highlighted important issues regarding violence against women and the protection of students and other vulnerable populations. The brutal nature of the crimes against Eileen Sarmenta sparked discussions about the need for better protection for women and stronger penalties for sexual violence. Educational institutions throughout the Philippines began implementing new safety measures and protocols designed to protect their students from similar crimes. The case served as a wake-up call about the potential dangers faced by young people, particularly women, and the need for vigilance and protective measures. The media coverage of the case also played an important role in raising public awareness about these issues. The extensive reporting on the trial and its aftermath helped to educate the public about the realities of political corruption and violence against women, contributing to broader social movements addressing these problems. In the years since their deaths, Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez have been remembered not just as victims of a terrible crime, but as symbols of innocence destroyed by evil and corruption. Their names have become associated with the fight for justice and the protection of the vulnerable. The University of the Philippines has honored their memory through various means, including scholarships and memorial programs designed to ensure that their sacrifice is not forgotten. These memorials serve not just to honor their memory, but to remind future generations of students about the importance of standing up against injustice and corruption. Eileen, in particular, has become a symbol for women's rights activists and journalists who continue to fight against violence and intimidation. Her courage in pursuing her journalistic work, even when it brought her into contact with dangerous individuals, has inspired others to continue the fight for truth and accountability. Alan's memory lives on in the agricultural programs at the university where he studied, and his story serves as a reminder of the senseless waste that occurs when innocent lives are cut short by violence and hatred. Even decades after the convictions, the Sanchez case continues to generate controversy and attention. There have been periodic discussions about the possibility of early release for the convicts, discussions that have invariably been met with strong opposition from victims' rights groups and the general public. In recent years, there have been legal challenges and policy changes that have raised questions about the sentences being served by Sanchez and his associates. These developments have reignited public interest in the case and renewed calls for ensuring that justice continues to be served. The case has also been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and other media productions that have helped to keep the story alive in public consciousness. These productions serve not just as entertainment, but as important reminders of the need for continued vigilance against corruption and violence. True crime podcasts and online discussions have introduced the case to new generations of Filipinos and international audiences, ensuring that the lessons of this terrible tragedy continue to be learned and remembered. The Sarmenta Gomez case represents both a triumph and a tragedy for the Philippine justice system. It was a triumph in that it demonstrated that even the most powerful individuals could be held accountable for their crimes, that witnesses could be protected and encouraged to come forward, and that the courts could function effectively even in highly politicized cases. But it was also a tragedy in that it took the brutal murders of two innocent young people to achieve this result. The case raised uncomfortable questions about how many other crimes might have been committed by powerful individuals who were never held accountable, and how many potential victims might have been saved if the system had worked more effectively to prevent such crimes. The lengthy legal proceedings, while ultimately successful, also highlighted some of the weaknesses in the Philippine judicial system. The fact that it took years to achieve final resolution of the case demonstrated the need for reforms to make the system more efficient and effective. Despite these concerns, the case ultimately stands as an important example of justice prevailing over power and corruption. It showed that when the public demands accountability, when witnesses are willing to come forward despite personal risks, and when the judicial system functions as it should, even the most heinous crimes can be properly punished. As we reflect on this case decades after it occurred, certain questions continue to resonate. How many other Eileens and Allens might have suffered similar fates at the hands of powerful predators who were never caught or prosecuted? How can society better protect its most vulnerable members from those who would abuse their power? The case also raises questions about the nature of evil itself. How do individuals reach a point where they can commit such brutal acts without apparent remorse? What creates the kind of environment where multiple people can participate in such crimes, each enabling and encouraging the others? These are not easy questions, and they don't have simple answers. But they are important questions that every society must grapple with if it hopes to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The story of Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez serves as a reminder that evil exists in the world, but it also demonstrates that justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. Their deaths were not in vain if they helped to prevent similar crimes and inspire continued efforts to build a more just and safe society. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez not just as victims of a terrible crime, but as young people who had dreams, aspirations, and hope for the future. Remember that their story, tragic as it is, ultimately became a story about the triumph of justice over evil, about the power of ordinary people to demand accountability from their leaders, and about the importance of never giving up the fight for what is right. Their memory lives on not just in the formal memorials and scholarships established in their honor, but in every act of courage by those who stand up against corruption and abuse of power. Every journalist who asks difficult questions, every student who refuses to be intimidated, every citizen who demands accountability from their leaders carries forward the legacy of these two brave young people. In the end, perhaps that is the most fitting memorial to Eileen Sarmenta and Alan Gomez, not just that their killers were brought to justice, but that their story continues to inspire others to fight for a better, safer, and more just world. Rest in peace, Eileen and Alan. Your stories have been told, your memories honored, and your sacrifices remembered. May your souls find the peace that was so cruelly denied to you in your final moments, and may your legacy continue to inspire future generations to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.